The wind off Lake Michigan cut through Elena's wool coat like a blade forged from pure malice. 2:17 in the morning. The kind of cold that made your bones ache and your lungs burn with every breath. Snow fell sideways, stinging her cheeks, collecting on her eyelashes, until she had to blink it away every few seconds, just to see the chaos unfolding in front of her. Container Yard. 7 at the Port of Chicago looked like a war zone. Floodlights carved harsh white circles into the darkness, illuminating the massive steel containers stacked 3 high, their surfaces already frosted with a thin layer of ice. Somewhere beyond the fence, a ship's horn bellowed into the night, mournful and low. Elena pressed her phone harder against her ear, her fingers numb despite her leather gloves. "I need you to listen to me very carefully," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor working its way up her spine. Not from cold, from the knowledge of what was at stake. Section 19.12 of the Customs Modernization Act, subsection C, medical supplies classified under HTS Code 3004 fall under emergency clearance provisions when accompanied by a letter of medical necessity from the receiving institution. On the other end of the line, the customs supervisor let out a long breath. She could picture him, probably warm in some government office, probably annoyed at being pulled from whatever late-night Netflix binge he'd been enjoying. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset, but the paperwork discrepancy..." The paperwork discrepancy is a transposed digit on line 47 of the commercial invoice. The shipper wrote 874 instead of 847. That's it. That's the entire reason $5 million worth of dialysis equipment is sitting in your impound lot while 36 patients at Northwestern Memorial are scheduled for treatment in... She glanced at her watch, the face fogged with condensation. 6 hours. Silence on the line. Elena closed her eyes, let the snow kiss her frozen face, and waited. She had learned over 18 years in this industry that silence was a weapon. Most people couldn't stand it. They filled it with words, with concessions, with cracks in their armor. "Let me call my supervisor." "Your supervisor is Michael Chen. His direct line is 773-555-0142. I have his personal cell if you'd prefer. We worked together on the Mercy Hospital shipment last March. The one where your department received a commendation from the Secretary of Health for expedited processing during the supply chain crisis." Another pause, longer this time. "Hold, please." Elena lowered the phone from her ear and exhaled, watching her breath crystallize and vanish into the night. Her feet had gone numb 20 minutes ago. Her nose had stopped running, which probably meant mild frostbite was setting in. She didn't care. Somewhere in that maze of metal containers sat the equipment that would keep people alive. People who had names and families and futures that depended on whether she could navigate the labyrinth of federal bureaucracy in the next few hours. Her driver, a young man named Carlos, who had been with Wellington Logistics for 3 years, appeared at her elbow with a steaming cup of coffee. She took it, wrapped both hands around it, felt the heat seep into her frozen fingers like a small miracle. "Any luck?" he asked. "Working on it. You know." Carlos said, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Most executives would have handled this from home, on the phone, in their pajamas. Elena took a sip of coffee. It was terrible. Gas station blend, burnt and bitter. It was also the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. Most executives don't know the difference between a bill of lading and a commercial invoice. They'd still be on hold with the General Customs hotline listening to Muzak. Her phone crackled back to life. "Ms. Wellington? Still here? I've spoken with Supervisor Chen. He's authorized emergency release under the medical necessity provision. I'll need you to sign a personal guarantee for the duty differential pending documentation correction. I'll be at your office in 15 minutes. She ended the call, handed the coffee back to Carlos, and began walking toward the car. Her legs moved stiffly, joints protesting against the cold, but she didn't slow down. There would be time to thaw out later. Right now, there were signatures to provide, forms to sign, and a convoy of trucks waiting to be loaded. By 5:37 in the morning, the last truck pulled out of Container Yard 7, its headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness, carrying $2.3 million worth of dialysis equipment toward Northwestern Memorial. By 6:15, Elena was in her car heater, blasting driving toward downtown Chicago as the first gray light of morning began to seep over the frozen lake. By 7:45, she had showered, changed into a charcoal Armani suit, and was sitting in the Wellington Logistics conference room, a fresh cup of coffee in front of her, watching the board members file in one by one. The conference room occupied the entire northwest corner of the 32nd floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline, the buildings still wreathed in morning mist, the lake a sheet of hammered steel in the distance. The table was mahogany polished to a mirror shine, surrounded by 12 leather chairs that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Everything about this room was designed to project power, stability, success. Elena sat in the 7th chair from the head of the table. Not the 6th, which would have placed her directly to the right of the CEO's position. Not the 8th, which would have aligned her with the junior executives. The 7th, a position she had occupied for so long that the leather had molded itself to her shape that the armrests bore the faint impression of her elbows. She watched the board members take their seats, exchanging pleasantries, checking phones, shuffling papers. Gerald Morrison, CFO, who still couldn't read a balance sheet without his reading glasses and a bottle of antacids. Patricia Huang, VP of Human Resources, who had 3 affairs with subordinates buried under ironclad NDAs. David Kowalski, VP of Operations, who took credit for systems Elena had designed and implemented while he was still trying to figure out how to use the company email. At exactly 8 o'clock, the door at the far end of the room swung open and Robert Wellington entered. Her father. At 65, Robert Wellington still commanded a room simply by entering it. 6 feet 2 inches of old money confidence, silver hair swept back from a face that belonged on currency shoulders that hadn't stooped despite decades of carrying what he believed to be the weight of an empire. He wore a navy Brioni suit that cost more than most people's cars, a Patek Philippe watch that cost more than most people's houses, and an expression of benevolent authority that he had practiced in the mirror for so long it had become indistinguishable from his actual personality. Behind him, trailing like a particularly well-dressed shadow, came Tiffany, Elena's sister. At 30, Tiffany Wellington had perfected the art of looking important without actually doing anything. Today, she wore a cream-colored Chanel suit that made her look like she was attending a garden party rather than a board meeting. Her honey-blonde hair falling in perfect waves around a face that had cost their father $40,000 in rhinoplasty and another $20,000 in orthodontics. She held an iPhone in one hand, its rose gold case catching the light, her manicured thumb scrolling through what Elena could only assume was Instagram. Robert took his seat at the head of the table. Tiffany settled into the chair to his right, the 6th chair, the position of honor. She didn't look up from her phone. "Good morning, everyone." Robert's voice filled the room, deep and resonant, the voice of a man accustomed to being listened to. "Before we begin today's agenda, I want to address the situation that developed last night at the port." Elena felt the familiar sensation of erasure beginning, like someone slowly turning down her volume until she faded into background noise. "As some of you may have heard," Robert continued, "we had a critical shipment held up in customs, medical equipment, time-sensitive, the kind of situation that can make or break our reputation with hospital clients." Gerald nodded gravely. Patricia made a sympathetic sound. David looked appropriately concerned. "I'm pleased to report that thanks to the Wellington name, our long-standing relationship with the Port Authority, and a few well-placed calls to our friends in Washington, the shipment was released early this morning. The trucks are en route to Northwestern as we speak." A ripple of approval moved around the table. Murmured congratulations. Robert accepted them with practiced humility. "I also want to recognize someone who showed tremendous team spirit during this crisis." He turned, placed a hand on Tiffany's shoulder. She looked up from her phone, startled, then arranged her features into an expression of modest pride. "Tiffany was on the phone with me all night, keeping morale high, making sure our team knew the family was behind them. That's the kind of leadership that keeps Wellington Logistics ahead of the competition." Tiffany smiled, a perfect crescent of white teeth. "I just wanted everyone to know we cared," she said. "It's so important to show support during stressful times." Elena stared at the conference table, at her own reflection in the polished mahogany. The woman staring back at her had bloodshot eyes rimmed with dark circles, chapped lips from hours of exposure to freezing wind. A faint redness on her nose and cheeks that might have been windburn or might have been the beginning of frostbite. This woman had stood in a blizzard at 2 a.m. reciting customs codes from memory, negotiating with federal officials, signing personal guarantees that put her own assets on the line. This woman was invisible. She looked up from the table, found her gaze settling on her father. He was still talking something about quarterly projections and market expansion, his voice a pleasant drone that filled the room without actually saying anything. She had heard this speech or versions of it hundreds of times. The words changed, but the music remained the same. The music of a man who had inherited a company from his father, who had coasted on relationships and reputation and the labor of people he never saw, who had convinced himself through sheer repetition that his success was deserved rather than bestowed. She thought about the customs supervisor's voice on the phone, the way it had shifted from annoyance to respect when she demonstrated that she actually knew what she was talking about. She thought about Carlos standing in the snow bringing her terrible coffee because he understood that she needed it. She thought about the truck drivers loading equipment in the pre-dawn darkness, trusting that the woman who had cleared the paperwork knew what she was doing. None of them were in this room. None of them would ever be in this room. And the people who were in this room would never know what had actually happened in Container Yard 7, because the version of events that mattered was the version that Robert Wellington decided to tell. Elena felt something shift inside her chest. Not anger, exactly. Not even disappointment, which would have required some residual expectation of fairness. This was something colder. Something that had been growing for years, fed by 1,000 small erasures, 1,000,000 tiny moments of being overlooked and undervalued and taken for granted. It was the feeling of a contract finally expiring. Of a debt that would never be repaid because the other party had no intention of ever acknowledging it existed. The meeting ended at 9:30. Elena gathered her things, nodded to the colleagues, who nodded to her, and made her way to the elevator. She had 3 reports to review, 2 vendor calls to make, and a supply chain optimization analysis that needed to be completed before the end of the week. The work never stopped. It simply waited, patient and endless, for her to return to it. The elevator doors opened. She stepped inside, pressed the button for the 34th floor where her office waited, and watched the doors begin to close. A hand shot through the gap. The doors retreated, and Robert Wellington stepped into the elevator. "Elena." He pressed the button for the lobby, even though she had already selected her floor. "Walk with me." It wasn't a request. She followed him out of the building into the gray Chicago morning across the plaza toward the coffee shop on the corner. He didn't speak as they walked, and she didn't fill the silence. She had learned that trick from him after all. She had learned most of her tricks from him, though he would never admit it. The coffee shop was nearly empty at this hour, the morning rush having come and gone. Robert ordered a black coffee, no sugar, and took a seat at a table by the window. Elena ordered nothing. She wasn't thirsty. "Your mother called me this morning," Robert said, stirring his coffee with a wooden stick even though there was nothing in it to stir. "She wants to do a family dinner tonight, for your birthday." Elena had almost forgotten. 38 years old today. 38 years of being Robert Wellington's eldest daughter, of being Margaret Wellington's most reliable child, of being Tiffany Wellington's invisible sister. "I have a late meeting," she said. "Cancel it." Robert looked up from his coffee, fixed her with those pale blue eyes that had intimidated boardrooms and broken competitors, and never once, not in 38 years, looked at her with anything resembling warmth. "Your mother has been planning this for weeks. She has a gift for you, a significant one." "What kind of gift?" Robert smiled. It was the smile he used in negotiations, the one that never reached his eyes. "You'll have to come to dinner to find out." He stood leaving his untouched coffee on the table and walked out of the shop without another word. Elena watched him go, watched him climb into the black Mercedes that had been idling at the curb, watched the car disappear into the morning traffic. She pulled out her phone. 12 emails had arrived since the board meeting ended. 3 voicemails. A calendar notification reminding her of the supply chain call in 20 minutes. The work never stopped. She opened her contacts, scrolled to her mother's name, and typed a message. "What time is dinner?" The response came almost immediately, as if her mother had been waiting with phone in hand. 7 o'clock sharp. Wear something nice. Your father has wonderful news." Elena stared at the message. Something nice? As if she ever wore anything else. As if she had ever shown up to a family function in anything less than perfect professional attire, hair-styled makeup, subtle every inch the dutiful eldest daughter. Wonderful news. She thought about her father's smile in the coffee shop, the way it hadn't reached his eyes, the way it never reached his eyes when he was about to do something he knew she wouldn't like. A gift, a significant one. She thought about every gift her parents had ever given her. The practical ones, always practical because Elena was the practical daughter, the one who didn't need indulgence or extravagance, the one who could be counted on to appreciate a new briefcase or a leather portfolio or a gift certificate to a business seminar. Tiffany got jewelry and cars and European vacations. Elena got tools. Things that would help her work harder, longer, more efficiently for the family. She thought about the company her grandmother had built from nothing 60 years ago when women weren't supposed to build companies. The shares that had passed to Elena when her grandmother died, the only person in the family who had ever seemed to actually see her. 49% of Wellington Logistics left to the granddaughter who reminded her of herself. She thought about the way her father's smile hadn't reached his eyes. Elena closed the message, slipped her phone back into her pocket, and began walking back toward the office. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the promise of more snow. Somewhere across the city, dialysis machines were being unloaded at Northwestern Memorial. Somewhere in Lake Forest, her mother was probably arranging flowers and calling caterers and planning the perfect birthday dinner. Somewhere in Elena's chest, the cold thing that had been growing for years turned over in its sleep. Wonderful news. She remembered something her grandmother had told her once in the last months before the cancer took her. They had been sitting in her grandmother's study surrounded by the framed photographs and business awards that documented 60 years of building something from nothing. Her grandmother's hands had been thin by then, papery and frail, but her eyes had still been sharp. The most dangerous moment in any negotiation is when the other side offers you exactly what you think you want. Elena stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for her floor, and watched the doors close. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished metal. Bloodshot eyes, chapped lips, the face of a woman who had been standing in a blizzard 6 hours ago fighting for a company that would never acknowledge her sacrifice. The most dangerous moment. She thought about birthday dinners and significant gifts and the smile that never reached her father's eyes. Or maybe she thought as the elevator began to rise, the most dangerous moment is when you finally stop wanting what they think you want. The doors opened. She stepped out. The work was waiting. It could wait a little longer. She walked past her office, past the assistants who nodded respectfully, past the conference rooms and the break room and the maze of cubicles that housed the people who actually kept Wellington Logistics running. She walked all the way to the corner office at the end of the hall, the one with the best view and the locked filing cabinet, and the private bathroom that her father had installed when he decided he needed a space to take naps between meetings. The CEO's office. Her father's office. She stood outside the door for a long moment, staring at the nameplate. Robert J. Wellington, Chief Executive Officer. The same nameplate that had hung there for 35 years since her grandfather died and her father inherited everything. Everything except the 49% that her grandmother had quietly, deliberately, defiantly given to the granddaughter who actually understood what it meant to build something. Elena turned away from the door. Tonight she would go to dinner. She would wear something nice. She would smile at her mother's small talk and tolerate her sister's vapid comments and sit across from her father as he delivered his wonderful news. And then she would see what kind of gift required a family dinner and a significant announcement and a smile that never ever reached Robert Wellington's eyes. She walked back to her office, closed the door, sat down at her desk, opened her laptop. The work was waiting. For now, the work was all she had. The Wellington estate in Lake Forest sat at the end of a private drive lined with bare oak trees, their branches reaching toward the gray January sky, like the fingers of supplicants begging for warmth that would not come for months. Elena pulled her Lexus through the iron gates at 6:45, 15 minutes early because she had learned long ago that arriving on time to her parents' house meant arriving late by their standards. The house itself was a Georgian colonial red brick and white columns, 4 stories of old money pretension, set against 3 acres of manicured grounds, now buried under a foot of snow. Her grandfather had built it in 1962, the year Wellington Logistics landed its first major government contract. Her grandmother had hated it. Too big, she used to say. Too cold. A house designed to impress strangers, rather than comfort family. Elena parked behind Tiffany's white Range Rover and sat for a moment, engine idling, heat blasting through the vents. Through the tall windows of the front parlor, she could see the warm glow of lamplight, the flicker of what was probably a fire in the massive stone fireplace. From outside, it looked like the kind of home where families gathered to share meals and memories, where children grew up feeling loved and valued, where generations passed down wisdom and wealth in equal measure. From outside, it looked like a lie. She turned off the engine, gathered her coat and purse, and walked up the flagstone path to the front door. Before she could ring the bell, the door swung open and her mother appeared in a cloud of Chanel No. 5 and forced cheer. Margaret Wellington was 63 years old and had spent the last 40 of those years perfecting the art of appearing happy. She wore a cream cashmere sweater and pearl earrings, her silver blonde hair swept up in an elegant twist, her face arranged in an expression of maternal warmth that Elena had long ago learned to recognize as a mask. The real Margaret lived somewhere behind those carefully made-up eyes, buried under decades of accommodating her husband's demands and pretending not to notice the cracks in her family's foundation. "Elena, darling, happy birthday." Margaret pulled her into a hug that smelled of expensive perfume and felt like embracing a mannequin. "You look tired. Are you sleeping enough?" "I'm fine, Mom. You work too hard. I keep telling your father Elena works too hard. But you know how he is. Come in. It's freezing out there." Elena stepped into the foyer, all marble floors and fresh flowers, and a crystal chandelier that cast prismatic light across the walls. The house was warm, almost oppressively, so the kind of warmth that came from money rather than love. She shrugged off her coat, handed it to the housekeeper who appeared silently at her elbow, and followed her mother toward the dining room. The table had been set for 4 fine china and crystal stemware and silver flatware polished to a mirror shine. Candles flickered in sterling holders. A centerpiece of white roses and eucalyptus filled the air with a scent that was probably meant to be soothing, but instead reminded Elena of funerals. Tiffany was already seated, phone in hand, thumbs moving across the screen with the practiced speed of someone who had never had to do anything more demanding with her fingers. She looked up as Elena entered, offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and returned to her scrolling. "Happy birthday, sis." "Thanks." 38. Wow, that's like almost 40. Elena said nothing. She had learned long ago that responding to Tiffany's comments only encouraged more of them. Sit. Margaret gestured toward the chair across from Tiffany. "Your father will be down in a moment. He had some calls to make. You know how it is. The business never stops." Elena sat. The chair was uncomfortable, the kind of antique that looked beautiful and felt like punishment. She folded her hands in her lap and waited, watching her mother flutter around the table, adjusting napkins that didn't need adjusting and straightening silverware that was already perfectly straight. "I ordered your favorite cake," Margaret said, her voice bright with the particular tone she used when she was lying. "Chocolate, from that bakery on Elm Street, the one with the French pastry chef." Chocolate was Tiffany's favorite. Elena's favorite was passion fruit, a preference she had mentioned at every birthday for the past 15 years, a preference that had never once resulted in an actual passion fruit cake appearing at her celebration. She had stopped expecting it around the time she turned 30. She had stopped caring around the time she turned 35. "That sounds lovely," Elena said. "Doesn't it? I told your father we have to make this birthday special. 38 is such an important milestone." Elena wondered what made 38 more important than 37 or 36 or any of the other birthdays that had passed in this same dining room with this same uncomfortable chair and this same chocolate cake that was never the flavor she wanted. But she didn't ask. Asking questions in this house rarely led to answers she wanted to hear. Heavy footsteps on the stairs announced her father's arrival. Robert Wellington entered the dining room with the air of a man accustomed to being the most important person in any room, his presence immediately shifting the energy from artificial cheer to something tighter, more controlled. He wore a navy blazer over a white Oxford shirt, the casual uniform of wealthy men who wanted to appear relaxed without actually being relaxed. "Elena." He nodded at her, then took his seat at the head of the table. "Good, you're here. Let's not waste time." "Robert." Margaret's voice carried a note of gentle reproach. "We haven't even had dinner yet. Can't we at least eat first?" "The food will keep." Robert fixed his wife with a look that Elena recognized, the look that said the discussion was over before it had begun. Margaret's protest died in her throat. She sat down, smoothed her napkin across her lap, and said nothing. The housekeeper appeared with a bottle of wine, a Chateau Margaux that probably cost more than most people's car payments. She poured for Robert first, then Margaret, then Elena. Tiffany waved her off, producing a slim silver flask from her purse and adding a generous splash of what smelled like vodka to her water glass. "To family," Robert said, raising his glass. "And to new beginnings." They drank. The wine was excellent, rich and complex, the kind of wine that deserved to be savored. Elena took a small sip and set her glass down. She had a feeling she would need her wits about her tonight. "Now then." Robert reached beneath his chair and produced a leather portfolio thick with papers, which he placed on the table in front of him with a soft thud. "Your birthday present." Elena looked at the portfolio. It was the kind used for legal documents, the kind that held contracts and agreements, and the kind of paperwork that changed lives. She thought about her father's smile in the coffee shop that morning, the one that hadn't reached his eyes. She thought about her grandmother's warning about dangerous moments. "Open it," Robert said. It was not a suggestion. Elena reached across the table and pulled the portfolio toward her. The leather was smooth and cold under her fingers. She unzipped it slowly, deliberately giving herself time to prepare for whatever waited inside. The first page was a cover letter on Wellington Logistics letterhead. The second page was a summary of terms. The third page was the beginning of what appeared to be a share transfer agreement, dense with legal language and numbered clauses and the kind of fine print that hid knives in its margins. She read the summary of terms twice, then a third time, making sure she understood what she was seeing. The words blurred and sharpened, as if they couldn't decide whether to be real. Transfer of 49% ownership stake in Wellington Logistics Incorporated from Elena Marie Wellington to Tiffany Ann Wellington. Consideration $1. She looked up from the document. Her father was watching her with the expression of a man who had already decided how this conversation would end. "I don't understand," she said, though she understood perfectly. "It's simple." Robert leaned back in his chair, steepled his fingers beneath his chin. "Your grandmother left you those shares because she was sentimental. She liked you. That's fine. But sentimentality has no place in business. Tiffany needs those shares." "Why?" "Because she's getting married." Elena glanced at her sister. Tiffany was still looking at her phone, apparently uninterested in the conversation that would determine the future of a company worth tens of millions of dollars. "To whom?" "Harrison Blackwell, the third." Robert said the name with the reverent tone usually reserved for religious figures. "His family owns Blackwell Capital. They've expressed interest in a strategic partnership with Wellington Logistics. But Harrison's father is old-fashioned. He wants to see that Tiffany has a stake in the family business. She has a stake. She owns 2%, the same 2% you gave her when she graduated college. 2% isn't enough. Harrison's family expects more. They expect a partner, not a dependent." The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. If Tiffany owns 49%, she becomes an equal partner, a woman of substance. The kind of woman the Blackwells would be proud to welcome into their family. Elena looked at her mother. Margaret was studying her wineglass as if it contained the secrets of the universe, her face carefully blank. "And what do I get?" Elena asked, turning back to her father. "You get to keep your job." Robert smiled the same smile from the coffee shop, the smile that never reached his eyes. "Chief Operating Officer. It's a good title, good salary, good benefits. You'll just step back from the ownership side of things. Let Tiffany handle the strategic decisions, the board meetings, the things that require a certain presence." "Presence? You know what I mean. Tiffany photographs well. She's good at events. Charming. The kind of face we need representing Wellington Logistics to the world. He waved his hand vaguely. "You're better behind the scenes. You've always been better behind the scenes." Elena thought about Container Yard 7. About standing in a blizzard at 2 a.m, reciting customs codes, saving $5 million worth of medical equipment through sheer force of competence and will. She thought about the board meeting this morning, about watching her father take credit for her work, about watching Tiffany accept praise for doing nothing. behind the scenes, invisible, useful but not valued. "I'm not going to sign this," she said. Her voice was calm, level, the voice she used in negotiations when she needed the other party to understand that she was serious without understanding how serious. Robert's smile flickered. "Excuse me. Those shares were left to me by grandmother. They're mine. I'm not giving them away for $1 so that Tiffany can impress some trust fund family." "Elena," Margaret's voice was soft pleading. "Please, think about what you're saying." "I've thought about it. The answer is no." The silence that followed was absolute. Even Tiffany looked up from her phone, her perfectly shaped eyebrows rising in surprise. Apparently, no one had told her that this dinner might involve actual conflict. Robert placed both hands flat on the table. His jaw tightened. His eyes, which had been cool and calculating, began to heat with something darker. "Let me explain something to you," he said, his voice dropping to the low register that Elena remembered from childhood, the voice that preceded punishment. "Those shares don't belong to you. They belong to this family, to this company. Your grandmother gave them to you because she was confused at the end. Sentimental. She didn't understand the implications of what she was doing. She understood perfectly. She was dying of cancer and pumped full of morphine. She wasn't thinking clearly. If I had known what she was planning, I would have stopped it. But you didn't know, because she didn't trust you." The words came out before Elena could stop them, sharp and true and irretrievable. Robert's hand slammed down on the table. The crystal stemware jumped. Wine sloshed over the rim of Margaret's glass, spreading across the white tablecloth like blood. "You ungrateful!" He stopped himself, took a breath, visibly wrestled his anger back under control. "I built this company. I turned a regional trucking business into a national logistics empire. Everything you have, your education, your career, your apartment, your car, all of it came from me, from my work, my sacrifice. You inherited this company from your father, who inherited it from grandmother. She built it. She built it from nothing while your grandfather was drinking himself to death at the country club. You just..." Elena paused, chose her next words carefully. "You just kept it running." The silence that followed was different from the one before. This silence had teeth. "You think you're so smart." Robert's voice was barely above a whisper. "You think because you can quote customs codes and balance spreadsheets that you understand how the world works. You don't. You don't understand anything." "Then explain it to me." "Fine. Here's how it works. You sign those papers tonight and everything stays the same. You keep your job, you keep your salary, you keep your nice little life. Your team keeps their jobs. Carlos, Maria, that accounting girl you're so fond of, what's her name, Jennifer. They all get to keep working, keep paying their mortgages, keep feeding their families." Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if you don't sign, I will make your life very, very difficult. I'll start with your team, the ones who are loyal to you instead of to the company. I'll fire them, all of them, tomorrow morning. And when they ask why, I'll tell them the truth. That Elena Wellington refused to do what was best for the family and they paid the price." "You can't do that. I'm the CEO. I can do whatever I want." Robert picked up his wineglass, took a long sip, set it down with exaggerated care. "But that's just the beginning. If you walk out of here without signing, I'll make sure you never work in logistics again. Not in Chicago. Not anywhere. I know everyone in this industry. Everyone. One phone call from me and you're unemployable. You'll be 40 years old with a useless resume and a reputation for being difficult. See how far your customs codes get you then." Elena looked at her mother. Margaret was staring at the wine stains spreading across the tablecloth, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. She would not help. She had never helped. She had spent 40 years choosing her husband over her children, and she was not going to change now. Elena looked at her sister. Tiffany had put down her phone and was watching the scene with the expression of someone observing a mildly interesting television program. No concern, no guilt, just vague curiosity about how this would all turn out. Elena looked at her father, at the man who had raised her, who had shaped her, who had taught her everything she knew about business and negotiation and the cold calculus of power. He was watching her with absolute confidence, secure in the knowledge that he held all the cards that she would do what she had always done, what she had been trained to do since childhood. She would submit. She would sacrifice. She would put the family first because that was what good daughters did, and Elena had always been the good daughter. "You're asking me to give up everything," she said quietly. "Everything grandmother left me. Everything I've worked for. For $1. "I'm not asking." Robert's voice was flat final. "I'm telling. You have two choices. Sign and keep your life. Or don't sign and lose everything. Your job, your team, your career, your reputation." He paused, let the words sink in. "I made you, Elena. Everything you are, I created. And I can unmake you just as easily." The candles flickered, the wine stains spread. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed 7. Elena thought about her grandmother, about the woman who had built an empire from nothing, who had survived a husband who drank, and a son who disappointed, and a world that told her every day that she didn't belong. About the way her grandmother had looked at her in those final months, with something like recognition, something like hope. "You remind me of myself," her grandmother had said. "Don't let them break you." Elena looked at the papers in front of her, at the share transfer agreement that would erase her grandmother's final gift, that would reward Tiffany for nothing and punish Elena for everything. She thought about Container Yard 7, about the blizzard and the customs codes and the $5 million worth of medical equipment that was probably saving lives right now because she had refused to give up. She thought about 18 years of early mornings and late nights of problems solved and crises averted, of building systems and training teams and holding together a company that would have collapsed years ago without her invisible labor. She thought about all the birthday cakes that had been chocolate instead of passion fruit. "I need to think about this," she said. Robert's eyes narrowed. "What's there to think about? It's a significant decision. I need time to review the documents, consult with my own attorney." "You don't need an attorney. This is a family matter. 49% of a multi-million-dollar company is a legal matter. I'll review the documents tonight. I'll give you my answer tomorrow." For a long moment, Robert said nothing. Elena could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the weighing of options, the assessment of risk. Push harder and she might dig in. Give her time and she might come to her senses. He had always prided himself on knowing when to apply pressure and when to step back. "Fine," he said finally. "Tomorrow. But Elena..." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to something that was almost intimate, almost paternal. "Don't make the wrong choice. You're a smart woman. Smart women know when they're beaten." Elena gathered the portfolio, tucked it under her arm, and stood. "Thank you for dinner," she said. "The cake looks delicious. I'm sorry I can't stay." She walked out of the dining room, retrieved her coat from the silent housekeeper, and stepped into the frozen January night. The cold hit her like a slap, sharp and clarifying after the suffocating warmth of the house. Behind her, through the tall windows, she could see her family still seated at the table. Her father was saying something to her mother, his face hard. Her mother was dabbing at the wine stain with her napkin, not looking up. Her sister had returned to her phone, already bored now that the drama had ended. Elena got into her car, started the engine, and sat for a moment in the darkness, watching her breath fog the windshield. She thought about her father's ultimatum. Sign or lose everything. She thought about her grandmother's warning. The most dangerous moment in any negotiation is when the other side offers you exactly what you think you want. She thought about the share transfer agreement in her lap, the legal language that would strip away everything her grandmother had given her, everything she had spent 18 years protecting and building and earning. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, Elena Wellington began to smile. It was not a happy smile. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a woman who had just realized something important, something that changed everything. Her father thought he held all the cards. Her father was wrong. She put the car in gear and drove away from the house, away from the family that had never seen her, toward the city lights glittering in the distance like promises waiting to be kept. Tomorrow she would give them her answer. But first she had a phone call to make. The Starlight Diner sat on the corner of Halsted and Division, a chrome and neon relic from an era when diners served coffee in ceramic mugs and waitresses called everyone honey. At 4:53 in the morning, it was nearly empty, just a long-haul trucker nursing a plate of eggs at the counter and a pair of nurses finishing their night shift with slices of pie that had probably been sitting in the display case since yesterday afternoon. Elena had chosen this place precisely because it was nowhere anyone from her world would ever go. The Wellington family frequented establishments with valet parking and wine lists and waitstaff who knew better than to make eye contact. The Starlight Diner had sticky menus and a jukebox that only played songs from the 1970s and a neon sign in the window that buzzed like an angry wasp. She sat in a booth near the back, the leather portfolio from last night resting on the table in front of her like an accusation. She had not slept. She had spent the hours between midnight and 4, going through the documents page by page, clause by clause, making notes in the margins with a red pen she had bought specifically for this purpose. The pages were now covered in her small, precise handwriting questions and observations and connections that formed a map only she could read. The bell over the door chimed. Elena looked up to see Marcus Chen stepping into the diner, briefcase in one hand, travel mug in the other, his usually immaculate suit slightly rumpled from being pulled on in haste. He scanned the room, spotted her, and made his way to the booth with the expression of a man who had been dragged from a warm bed to deal with something he suspected would ruin his entire week. This better be important. He slid into the seat across from her, set his briefcase on the worn vinyl beside him. Your message said urgent. Your message said family emergency. Your message did not say I would be meeting you in a diner that looks like it was decorated by someone who peaked in 1974. Coffee. I have coffee. He lifted his travel mug, took a long sip, grimaced. Had coffee. It's cold now. Fine, yes. Coffee. Elena signaled the waitress, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, with a name tag that said Dolores, who shuffled over with a pot of coffee and 2 mugs that had probably seen better decades. She poured without comment, left the pot on the table, and shuffled away. Marcus wrapped his hands around the mug, let the warmth seep into his fingers, and fixed Elena with a look that was equal parts concern and irritation. Talk to me. What's happening? Elena pushed the portfolio across the table. My birthday present. Marcus opened the portfolio, began reading. His expression shifted from irritation to confusion to something that looked increasingly like horror as he turned the pages. By the time he reached the summary of terms, his coffee sat forgotten, going cold for the second time that morning. This is... He flipped back to the beginning, read it again as if hoping the words might have changed in the intervening seconds. Elena, this is robbery. This is broad daylight, gun to your head, hand over the wallet robbery. They want you to transfer 49% of a company worth... He did some quick mental math. Conservatively, $60 million. For $1. $1. I know. Your grandmother left you those shares specifically, explicitly. The will was airtight. I know because I helped draft it. Marcus was fully awake now, his legal mind spinning through implications and options. We can fight this. Undue influence, coercion, breach of fiduciary duty. Your father threatened your employees. He threatened your career. That's textbook duress. No court in Illinois would enforce an agreement signed under these conditions. Elena picked up her coffee, took a slow sip, set it down. The coffee was terrible, burnt and bitter, but she had grown fond of terrible coffee in the past 24 hours. It reminded her of Container Yard 7. It reminded her of who she really was, underneath the Armani suits and the corner office, and the 18 years of making herself invisible. Turn to page 42, she said. Marcus frowned, flipped through the documents until he found the page. What am I looking at? Clause 11.b. Read it. He read. His frown deepened. He read it again. The loan agreement, he said slowly. The $40 million credit facility with First Chicago Bank. This clause references the original loan terms. Keep reading. Debt service coverage ratio covenant. The company must maintain a DSCR of at least 1.25. If the ratio falls below that threshold for 2 consecutive quarters... Marcus trailed off, his eyes widening as the implications began to unfold. The bank can declare a technical default and accelerate the entire loan. Keep going. Change of control provision. Any transfer of more than 20% of ownership requires prior written consent from the lender or... He looked up from the document, his face pale in the fluorescent light. Or the bank can call the loan immediately. Elena nodded. My father is about to force me to sign over 49% of the company to my sister. That triggers the change of control clause. The bank will have grounds to declare default. But surely they'll cure it, get the bank's consent after the fact. Maybe, if they ask nicely, if the bank is feeling generous. But here's the thing about First Chicago Bank. Elena leaned forward, her voice dropping, even though there was no one nearby to hear. They've been looking for an exit from this loan for 18 months. The relationship manager told me as much at the last quarterly review. Wellington Logistics is over-leveraged, under-diversified, and run by a CEO who hasn't had an original idea since 1992. The bank has been waiting for an excuse to get out. My father is about to hand them one. Marcus set down the documents, rubbed his temples with both hands. Okay. So the bank might call the loan. That's bad. That's very bad. But the company can refinance. Find another lender. With what collateral? The company's assets are already pledged against the existing loan. And the DSCR... Elena pulled the documents back toward her, flipped to a page covered in her red pen annotations. Look at these numbers. Last quarter, the ratio was 1.31, barely above the covenant threshold. And that was with me running operations at maximum efficiency. With me negotiating every vendor contract, optimizing every route, squeezing every penny out of every process. What happens if you're not there? You tell me. Elena sat back, let the question hang in the air between them. Tiffany has never read a balance sheet in her life. My father hasn't been involved in day-to-day operations for a decade. The CFO is a yes man who got his job by agreeing with everything my father says. If I walk out that door, who maintains the DSCR, who keeps the cash flow stable, who makes sure the trucks run on time and the contracts get fulfilled and the customers don't flee to competitors? Marcus was silent for a long moment, staring at the documents, his lawyer's mind working through the scenarios. No one, he said finally. No one does. The operation falls apart. The DSCR drops. The bank calls the loan. And then, Marcus picked up his coffee, realized it was cold again, set it down with a grimace. And then the company defaults. The bank seizes the collateral. Wellington Logistics either declares bankruptcy or gets sold at a fire sale price. And who loses everything? Your father, your sister, everyone except... He stopped, looked at her with new eyes as if seeing her for the first time. Except you. Except because you won't have any ownership stake to lose. You'll have already signed it away. Elena said nothing. She picked up her coffee, took another sip of the terrible burnt brew, and waited for Marcus to catch up to where she had been since 3 o'clock that morning. You want to sign it? He said slowly. You want to give them exactly what they're asking for. I want to give them what they think they're asking for. Elena, Marcus leaned forward, his voice urgent. Think about what you're saying. You're talking about letting your family's company fail, letting your father lose everything, letting dozens, maybe hundreds of employees lose their jobs. My father is going to fire my team anyway. He told me as much last night. If I sign, they might get a few more months before Tiffany drives the company into the ground. If I don't sign, they're gone tomorrow. She set down her coffee, met his eyes with a steadiness that surprised even her. I've run the numbers, Marcus. I've played out every scenario. If I stay and fight, I spend the next 10 years in litigation while my father bleeds me dry with legal fees. If I stay and surrender, I spend the next 10 years working myself to death to prop up a company that will never acknowledge my contribution. If I leave, gravity does the rest. The silence that followed was different from the others. This was the silence of understanding, of recognition of two people arriving at the same terrible conclusion from different directions. This isn't revenge, Marcus said quietly. Is it? No. Elena shook her head slowly. Revenge would require me to do something to them. I'm not doing anything. I'm just stopping. I'm removing myself from a situation that has been destroying me for 18 years. If the company collapses without me, that's not my fault. That's just reality finally catching up with the lie my father has been telling himself since the day he inherited everything. But the employees, the people who depend on those jobs. The good ones will find new positions. I'll help them. I have contacts throughout the industry. The ones who are loyal to my father. She paused, chose her next words carefully. They made their choice. We all make choices. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, turning his cold coffee cup in his hands. Outside, the first gray light of dawn was beginning to seep through the diner windows, turning the neon signs pale and sickly. What do you need from me? He asked finally. 2 things. Elena reached into her purse, pulled out a folded piece of paper, slid it across the table. First, I need you to witness my signature on the share transfer agreement. Make sure everything is properly notarized and filed. I want this to be completely legal, completely airtight. No loopholes for my father to exploit later. Marcus took the paper, unfolded it, read it. His eyebrows rose. A resignation letter. Effective immediately. I'm not just giving them the shares. I'm giving them everything. The whole company. Let them see what it's worth without me holding it together. And the second thing, Elena smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a woman who had finally stopped pretending. I need you to be ready. When the bank comes calling, when the creditors start circling, when my father realizes what he's done, I'm going to need someone who knows where all the bodies are buried, someone who can help me pick up the pieces. Pick up the pieces? You just said you're walking away. I'm walking away from my father's company. Elena picked up the portfolio, tucked it under her arm, and stood. But Wellington Logistics has good bones, good contracts, good employees, at least the ones worth keeping. When the dust settles, when the bankruptcy auction happens, when my father is forced to sell at pennies on the dollar, I plan to be the one holding the checkbook. She left a 20 on the table, enough to cover the coffee and a generous tip for Dolores. Marcus remained in the booth, staring at the resignation letter, his expression a mixture of admiration and something that might have been fear. Elena. His voice stopped her at the door. What happens if you're wrong? What happens if your father finds a way out? If Tiffany somehow learns to run the company? If the bank decides not to call the loan? Elena turned, silhouetted against the pale dawn light streaming through the windows. Then I'll have given up 49% of a successful company for nothing. I'll have walked away from everything I built. She paused, let the weight of the words settle. But I know my father, and I know my sister. They've never had to face a consequence in their lives. They don't know how to survive without someone else doing the hard work for them. And you do? I've been doing the hard work for 18 years. She pushed open the door, felt the cold January air rush in. I think I've earned the right to stop. The door swung shut behind her. Marcus sat alone in the booth, surrounded by the smell of burnt coffee and the sound of the jukebox cycling to another song about heartbreak and highways. He looked down at the resignation letter in his hands. Effective immediately. He thought about everything Elena had told him, about the loan covenants and the DSCR and the change of control clause, about the father who had built his throne on the labor of an invisible daughter, about the sister who had never worked a day in her life and was about to inherit an empire she couldn't possibly manage. He thought about gravity, about how it was patient and inevitable and utterly without mercy. He folded the resignation letter, tucked it into his briefcase, and signaled Dolores for another cup of coffee. It was going to be a long day. The Wellington estate looked different in the morning light. Smaller, somehow. Less imposing. The bare oak trees that had seemed so dramatic in the darkness now just looked dead, their branches reaching toward a sky the color of dirty dishwater. Elena parked in the same spot she had occupied last night behind Tiffany's Range Rover and sat for a moment, gathering herself. She had gone home after the diner, showered, changed into fresh clothes, a simple black dress that she usually reserved for funerals, applied makeup with more care than she had taken in years, making sure her face was a perfect mask revealing nothing. She looked, she thought, like a woman attending her own execution, which in a way she was. The front door opened before she could knock. Her mother stood in the doorway, still in her bathrobe, her face puffy from what had probably been a sleepless night. Elena, thank God. Your father has been... Margaret stopped, took in her daughter's appearance, the portfolio under her arm. You're going to sign. It was not a question. Yes. Margaret's face crumpled with relief. She reached out, pulled Elena into a hug that was tighter and more genuine than any embrace they had shared in years. Thank you, sweetheart. I knew you'd make the right choice. I knew you wouldn't abandon your family. Elena stood still in her mother's arms, accepting the hug without returning it. She thought about the machine she had seen in Margaret's purse last night, the recorder that her mother had planned to use against her. She thought about 40 years of choosing the wrong side, of enabling a tyrant, of sacrificing daughters on the altar of a husband's ego. Where's Dad? In the study. He's been there all night. I don't think he slept at all. Margaret pulled back, dabbed at her eyes with the sleeve of her bathrobe. He was so worried, Elena. We both were. We thought you might do something foolish. I'm not going to do anything foolish. Elena stepped past her mother into the foyer toward the study at the back of the house. I'm going to do exactly what Dad asked. The study was Robert Wellington's sanctuary, a room full of dark wood and leather furniture, and the mounted heads of animals he had paid other people to kill. He sat behind a massive desk, still wearing the clothes from last night, his silver hair disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed and shadowed. A crystal tumbler sat in front of him, empty beside a bottle of scotch that was considerably less full than it had been 12 hours ago. He looked up as Elena entered, and for just a moment she saw something in his face that might have been fear. Then the mask came down, and he was Robert Wellington again, the tyrant, the king, the man who had never admitted to a mistake in his entire life. You're back. I'm back. Elena set the portfolio on his desk, opened it, turned to the signature page. I've reviewed the documents. I'm prepared to sign. Robert's eyes narrowed, searching her face for some sign of deception. Just like that. Just like that. She pulled a pen from her purse, the same red pen she had used to annotate the documents at the diner, and held it over the signature line. But first, I want to be clear about what's happening here. I want you to look me in the eye and tell me that this is what you want. Of course it's what I want. I wouldn't have asked if it wasn't what I wanted. You want me to give up 49% of the company that grandmother built, the shares she left me specifically because she didn't trust you with them. You want me to hand them to Tiffany, who has never read a financial statement, who has never managed an employee, who has never done a single day of real work in her entire life. You want me to do this so that she can impress some trust fund family and marry a man whose only qualification is that his great-grandfather made a fortune in steel. Elena's voice was steady calm, the voice of a woman reading terms and conditions. Is that correct? Robert's jaw tightened. That's a very cynical way of putting it. Is it incorrect? Tiffany will grow into the role. She has potential. She has potential. Elena nodded slowly. All right, if you say so. She signed her name on the signature line. The pen moved smoothly across the paper, leaving behind letters that were neat and precise and absolutely irrevocable. She signed the second page, and the third initialed the clauses her father's lawyers had flagged, dated each page in the space provided. When she was finished, she straightened up, capped the pen, and looked at her father with an expression that was completely unreadable. Congratulations, she said. It's done. The shares are Tiffany's now. All of them. She paused, let the words settle. The assets and the liabilities, the contracts and the covenants, the employees and the obligations. All of it. She's responsible for all of it now. Robert reached for the documents, began flipping through them, checking the signatures, making sure everything was in order. His hands were trembling slightly, though whether from relief or alcohol or something else entirely, Elena couldn't tell. Good, he said. Good. I knew you'd come to your senses. I knew you'd do the right thing for this family. I'm not finished. Robert looked up. Elena reached into her purse, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and placed it on the desk beside the portfolio. What's this? My resignation. Effective immediately. The silence that followed was absolute. Robert stared at the paper, then at Elena, then at the paper again, as if hoping one of them might explain what he was seeing. Your resignation. I'm leaving Wellington Logistics. Today, right now. I'm cleaning out my office this afternoon, and I won't be back. Elena's voice was pleasant, conversational, as if she were discussing the weather. I assumed you'd want to know, since you'll need to find someone to handle my responsibilities. The vendor negotiations that are due this week, the customs review that's scheduled for Monday, the quarterly financial reports that need to be filed with the bank by the 15th. You can't resign. Robert's voice was rising, the controlled fury of a man who was just beginning to realize that something had gone very wrong. You just signed the papers. You agreed to stay on as COO. I agreed to transfer my shares. I never agreed to keep working for a company that no longer belongs to me. Elena smiled the same pleasant smile she used in negotiations when the other party had just made a critical error. You should read the documents more carefully, Dad. Clause 7.4. The share transfer is independent of any employment arrangement. You got my shares. You don't get my labor. This is betrayal. This is sabotage. You planned this. I planned to give you exactly what you asked for. Elena turned toward the door. You wanted the shares, you have them. You wanted Tiffany to be the face of the company, now she can be. You told me last night that you don't need me. That Tiffany could hire 10 people like me. So hire them. I'm sure they'll do a wonderful job. You think you're clever. Robert was on his feet now, his face flushed with rage, his hands balled into fists at his sides. You think this changes anything. You're nothing without this company, nothing without this family. I made you. Everything you know, everything you are came from me. And you think you can just walk away? Elena stopped at the door, her hand on the frame. She turned, looked at her father, really looked at him, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in her life. She saw the bluster and the rage and the desperation underneath the dawning awareness that something had shifted, that the ground beneath his feet was no longer as solid as he had believed. You didn't make me, Dad. Grandmother made me. She taught me everything worth knowing about business, about integrity, about building something real instead of just inheriting something and pretending you earned it. Elena's voice was quiet, almost gentle. You know what else she taught me? She taught me that some people will never see your value no matter how hard you work, no matter how much you sacrifice. And when you finally realize that you have two choices, keep sacrificing, keep hoping, keep dying by inches, or walk away and let them face the consequences of their own choices. Consequences. Robert laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. What consequences? I've been running this company for 35 years. I can run it without you. Tiffany can learn. We'll hire consultants. We'll bring in experts. You're not as irreplaceable as you think you are. Maybe not. Elena smiled again, and there was something in that smile that made Robert's laughter die in his throat. I guess we'll find out. She walked out of the study, through the foyer, past her mother, who stood wringing her hands and asking what happened, what's going on. Elena, please wait. She walked out the front door into the cold January morning toward her car waiting in the driveway. Behind her, she heard her father's voice raised to a shout that echoed across the frozen lawn. You think I need you? I don't need you. Tiffany can hire 10 people like you, 100 people. You're nothing, Elena. Nothing without this family. Elena opened her car door, paused, looked back at the house one last time, at the Georgian columns and the red brick facade and the windows that reflected the gray winter sky like blind eyes. Start counting, she said. Her voice was quiet, but somehow it carried across the distance between them, clear and cold as the January air. Then she got in her car, started the engine, and drove away. She did not look back. 2 weeks felt like a lifetime when you stopped measuring time by deadlines and deliverables. Elena stood in the kitchen of her Lincoln Park apartment, a vintage watering can in hand, carefully tending to the collection of houseplants that lined the windowsill above her sink. A fiddle-leaf fig she had bought 3 years ago and never had time to properly care for. A pothos that had been slowly dying from neglect. A small collection of succulents that her assistant Jennifer had given her for Christmas, still in their original pots because she had never found a moment to repot them. Now she had nothing but moments. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting long golden rectangles across the hardwood floor. It was 10:30 in the morning on a Tuesday, an hour when she would normally have been in her third meeting of the day, juggling vendor calls and logistics reports and the endless small crises that kept Wellington Logistics running. Instead, she was wearing yoga pants and an oversized sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders, her feet bare against the cool floor. She moved from plant to plant, checking soil, moisture, examining leaves for signs of stress, adjusting positions to maximize sunlight exposure. Simple tasks. Meditative tasks. The kind of tasks that required just enough attention to keep the mind occupied without demanding anything more. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She ignored it, finished watering the succulents, set down the watering can, and only then allowed herself to look at the screen. A text from Jennifer. "You need to hear this." Elena picked up the phone, walked to the living room, settled onto the yoga mat she had laid out earlier that morning. She had started doing yoga 3 days after her resignation, partly because she needed something to fill the hours, partly because her body had been carrying 18 years of tension that was only now beginning to release. Her shoulders ached constantly, her neck was stiff, her lower back complained every time she tried to sit still. The yoga helped, slowly. She opened the message thread with Jennifer, scrolled through the updates that had been trickling in over the past 2 weeks. Jennifer Huang had been Elena's assistant for 6 years, a brilliant young woman with a degree in finance who had taken an administrative job because she believed in learning from the ground up. She had also been one of the first people Robert had fired the day after Elena's resignation as part of what he called a restructuring initiative and what everyone else recognized as a purge of anyone loyal to his eldest daughter. Jennifer had landed on her feet as Elena had known she would. A position at a competing logistics firm, better pay, better hours, better future. But she had also maintained contact with friends still inside Wellington Logistics Friends, who were happy to share what was happening in the wake of Elena's departure. The updates painted a picture that would have been amusing if it hadn't involved real people's livelihoods. Day 3. Tiffany arrived at the office at 11:30, complained about the coffee left at 2 for a spa appointment. Day 5. Robert discovered that Elena's direct reports had been doing work he thought was being handled by different departments entirely. 3 separate functions had to be redistributed among people who had no idea how to perform them. Day 8. Tiffany fired the chief accounting officer, a woman named Patricia Moreno, who had been with the company for 12 years, because, and this was a direct quote, she had a negative energy that was blocking Tiffany's creative vision. Day 10. Patricia's replacement arrived. A young woman named Brittany, something a college friend of Tiffany's whose primary qualification appeared to be her willingness to agree with everything Tiffany said. Day 12, Tiffany approved a $200,000 renovation of the CEO's office, including new furniture, new carpet, a meditation corner, and a juice bar. Day 14. Today. Elena read Jennifer's latest message twice. The routing system crashed this morning. Complete failure. No one can access the logistics database. No one knows the admin credentials. David Kowalski has been on the phone with the IT vendor for 4 hours trying to get emergency access, but apparently there is some kind of security protocol that requires verification from the system administrator. Elena set down the phone, lay back on her yoga mat, and stared at the ceiling. The routing system. The central nervous system of Wellington Logistics, the software that coordinated every truck, every shipment, every delivery across the entire network. She had implemented that system 7 years ago, had overseen its installation, had personally configured the security protocols to ensure that no single point of failure could bring down the entire operation. The admin credentials were tied to her personal account, an account that, per the IT security policy she had drafted and her father had signed without reading, would have been automatically deactivated and purged 72 hours after her departure. She had not sabotaged anything. She had not changed any passwords or deleted any files or planted any logic bombs in the code. She had simply left and in leaving had taken with her the institutional knowledge that made the system work. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Jennifer. It gets worse. There is a shipment stuck at the port. Medical equipment again. The same customs issue from last month. No one knows how to handle it. No one even knows who to call. Elena closed her eyes, let the information wash over her, felt something complicated moving through her chest. Not quite satisfaction. Not quite grief. Something in between, something that had no name, but felt like the slow release of a breath she had been holding for 18 years. This was what she had predicted. This was what she had known would happen from the moment she signed those papers in her father's study. The house of cards was beginning to tremble. She rolled onto her side, pushed herself up to sitting, and reached for her phone again. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, considering. Then she typed a response to Jennifer. "Keep me updated." And Jennifer. "Thank you." The response came almost immediately. "You saved my career by connecting me with Hartwell Logistics. This is the least I can do. Also, everyone here says hello and hopes you are doing well." Elena smiled a small private expression that no one was there to see. She was doing well. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she was doing well. The yoga routine took 45 minutes, a sequence she had learned from a video series recommended by a colleague years ago, a series she had bookmarked and never found time to actually watch. Now she had time. Now she had nothing but time. Downward dog warrior 1, warrior 2, triangle pose. Her body moved through the positions with increasing ease, the stiffness in her joints slowly giving way to something that might eventually become flexibility. She breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth, counting each breath, letting the rhythm carry her away from the thoughts that wanted to crowd in. What was happening at Wellington? What her father was thinking? What her sister was doing? Whether the medical equipment would reach the hospital in time? Whether anyone would suffer because she had walked away? She pushed the thoughts aside, returned to her breath, returned to the mat beneath her, and the sunlight streaming through the windows, and the simple fact of her own body moving through space. This was her life now. This quiet apartment, these neglected plants, this yoga mat. No phone calls at 2 a.m, no board meetings where she sat invisible in the corner, no father who looked through her as if she were made of glass. The guilt would come later, she knew. It was already starting, small tendrils of doubt that crept in during the quiet moments, questions about responsibility and collateral damage, and the employees who would lose their jobs when the company finally collapsed. She would have to deal with that guilt eventually, would have to find a way to live with the consequences of her choices. But not today. Today she was going to water her plants and do her yoga, and maybe for the first time in 18 years take a walk in the middle of a weekday afternoon for no reason other than because she wanted to. She was in warrior 2, arms extended, gaze fixed on her forward hand when her phone rang. The sound cut through the silence of the apartment like a knife, shrill and insistent, demanding attention. Elena held the pose for 3 more breaths, finished the sequence, and only then walked over to where her phone sat on the kitchen counter. The caller ID showed a name she had expected to see much sooner. Dad. She let it ring twice more, watching the screen pulse with each electronic chirp. Then she answered. "Hello, Robert?" The use of his first name was deliberate. She was no longer his daughter, no longer his employee, no longer anyone who owed him the courtesy of familial address. She was a stranger who had once lived in his house, nothing more. "What the hell did you do?" His voice came through the speaker, tight with barely controlled rage. The voice of a man who was not accustomed to being defied, and was only now beginning to understand the cost of his own arrogance. "The system is down. The entire logistics network is frozen. We have shipments sitting at ports across the country and no way to track them." "I'm aware." "You're aware." Robert's laugh was harsh, humorless. "Of course you're aware. Because you did this. You sabotaged the system before you left, changed the passwords, locked everyone out." Elena walked to her window, looked out at the city spread below her, the streets busy with people going about their ordinary Tuesday lives. "I didn't change anything. The admin credentials were tied to my personal account. When I left the company, that account was deactivated per standard security protocol." "What security protocol?" "The one you signed 14 months ago, IT Policy Revision 7.3. When an employee with system administrator access separates from the company, their credentials are automatically revoked and the account is purged after 72 hours. It's designed to prevent exactly this kind of situation, actually. Disgruntled former employees accessing systems they no longer have authorization to use." Silence on the other end of the line. Elena could almost hear her father's blood pressure rising. "That policy was for regular employees, not for executives. The policy applies to all employees with system administrator access. I was the only executive with that access because I was the only one who understood how the system worked." Elena kept her voice pleasant, conversational, the voice she had used in thousands of negotiations over the years. "You should have designated a backup administrator before accepting my resignation. That's standard practice in any competently run organization. Don't lecture me about how to run my company. I wouldn't dream of it. It's not my company anymore, remember? You made that very clear. More silence. Then through gritted teeth, "What's the password?" "I just explained this, Robert. The password doesn't exist anymore. The account was purged. You'll need to contact the software vendor and go through their emergency access protocol. It usually takes 72 to 96 hours, and they'll need proof of ownership, current business registration authorization from the registered system administrator." "You're the registered administrator." "I was. The registration should have been updated when I left. Was it not updated?" Elena allowed a note of innocent confusion to enter her voice. "That's unfortunate. The vendor is very strict about security. They won't grant access to anyone not listed on the current registration documents." "Then update the documents. Sign whatever needs to be signed." "I'm not an employee of Wellington Logistics. I can't sign documents on behalf of a company I don't work for." Elena turned away from the window, walked back to her yoga mat, sat down cross-legged in the center. "You'll need to contact your legal department. Have them prepare a new system administrator registration with Tiffany's information, since she's now the majority shareholder. Once the registration is updated and the vendor verifies the change of control, they should be able to grant emergency access within, I believe the standard timeline is 2 to 3 weeks. 2 to 3 weeks. Robert's voice had gone quiet, dangerously quiet, the voice Elena remembered from childhood, the voice that preceded the worst punishments. "We have contracts that need to be fulfilled, shipments that need to be delivered, customers who are threatening to sue." "Then I suggest you work quickly." "Elena." Her father's voice changed, shifting from fury to something that was trying very hard to sound reasonable. "Look, I know things were said, heated words in the moment, but this is bigger than our personal disagreements. People's jobs are at stake. The company your grandmother built is at stake. Whatever differences we have, you can't want to see that destroyed. Grandmother left me those shares because she trusted me to protect what she built. You forced me to sign them away so that Tiffany could impress a boyfriend's family." Elena's voice remained steady, almost serene. "You told me you didn't need me. You told me Tiffany could hire 100 people like me, so hire them, solve your own problems. That's what leaders do, isn't it? That's what you've always told me." "This is extortion. This is blackmail. I'll have my lawyers—" "You'll have your lawyers do what exactly? Sue me for following the security policy you signed? Sue me for not volunteering my personal time to fix problems at a company that fired me?" Elena laughed softly. "Go ahead. Call your lawyers. I'm sure they'll be very sympathetic." "God damn it, Elena." The reasonable facade cracked, revealing the rage underneath. "You owe this family. You owe me. After everything I've done for you, after all the opportunities I've given you, this is how you repay me, by standing by while everything falls apart." "I'm not standing by anything. I'm sitting in my apartment watering my plants, practicing yoga. What happens at Wellington Logistics is no longer my concern." Elena reached for her water bottle, took a long sip, let the silence stretch. "Is there anything else?" "You have to come back. You have to fix this." "No. I'm not asking. And I'm not coming." Elena set down the water bottle, lay back on her yoga mat, stared up at the ceiling. "Goodbye, Robert. Good luck with the vendor. I hear they're very thorough." "Elena, don't you dare hang up on me." "Elena. Elena." She ended the call. For a long moment she lay there, phone resting on her stomach, watching dust motes drift through the sunbeams slanting across the ceiling. Her heart was beating faster than it had during the entire yoga routine, adrenaline singing through her veins, her hands trembling slightly with the aftershock of confrontation. She had done it. She had actually done it. 18 years of automatic compliance of "yes, sir," and "right away, sir," and "whatever you need, sir." And she had finally said no. The phone buzzed in her hand. Another call from the same number. She declined it. It buzzed again. Same number. Decline. Again. 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 Elena opened her settings, navigated to the blocked contacts list, and added her father's number. Then, after a moment's consideration, she added her mother's number as well, and Tiffany's, though she doubted her sister even knew how to make a phone call that didn't involve FaceTime filters. the phone went silent. She lay there for a while longer, feeling her heartbeat slowly return to normal feeling, the adrenaline fade, and something else take its place. Something that felt like freedom. Something that felt like the first day of the rest of her life. Then she got up, walked to the kitchen, and made herself a cup of tea. The updates continued to arrive over the following days, each one painting another stroke in the portrait of a company in freefall. The medical equipment shipment sat at the port for 4 days before someone finally figured out how to contact the customs office. By then, the customer had already filed a breach of contract claim. The hospital had sourced replacement equipment from a competitor at a 30% markup and was demanding Wellington Logistics pay the difference. The routing system remained offline for 11 days. During that time, dispatchers resorted to coordinating shipments via spreadsheet and phone calls, a process that was roughly as efficient as trying to conduct surgery with a butter knife. Deliveries that should have taken 2 days took 5. Customers who were accustomed to real-time tracking information received shrugged apologies and vague estimates. Tiffany's solution to the crisis was to fire the IT director for incompetence and hire a social media consultant to manage the company's online reputation. The social media consultant's first recommendation was to create a TikTok account. Tiffany approved a $50,000 content creation budget. The driver who had brought Elena coffee in the snow that night, Carlos, was among the first wave of layoffs. Officially, the company was restructuring for efficiency. Unofficially, Robert was cutting anyone he suspected of having been loyal to his daughter. Elena heard about it from Jennifer, reached out to Carlos through LinkedIn, and connected him with a position at Hartwell Logistics within a week. She did the same for Maria, from accounting for David's assistant, who had always slipped Elena the real board meeting agendas before her father could sanitize them for the night shift supervisor, who had coordinated the container yard response during the blizzard. One by one, she reached out to the people who had made Wellington Logistics actually function, and one by one, she helped them find lifeboats before the ship went down. It was not altruism exactly. It was debt repayment. These were the people who had worked alongside her for years, who had trusted her, who had lost their jobs because of choices she had made. The least she could do was make sure they landed somewhere soft. And if those soft landings happened to be at Wellington's competitors, well, that was just the market at work. 3 weeks after her resignation, Elena received a different kind of message. Not from Jennifer, not from any of her former colleagues, but from Marcus. The bank called. They want a meeting. Elena read the message, set down her phone, and smiled. The countdown had begun. The end of the fiscal quarter arrived like a bill collector, punctual and utterly without mercy. Elena learned about the quarterly financial review the same way she had learned about everything else since her departure, through the quiet network of former colleagues who had scattered to the 4 winds but still maintained their connections like nerve endings severed from a dying limb. Jennifer sent the first message, a brief note that contained only a screenshot of an internal email and 3 words. Here it comes. The screenshot showed a message from First Chicago Bank to Wellington Logistics, marked urgent, requesting an immediate meeting to discuss material changes to the company's financial position. The language was formal, bloodless, the kind of corporate speak that concealed sharp edges beneath soft words. We have noted certain discrepancies in your quarterly submission. We believe it would be mutually beneficial to discuss these matters in person at your earliest convenience. Elena read the message sitting at her kitchen table, a cup of green tea cooling beside her laptop, morning light streaming through windows. She had finally gotten around to cleaning. 4 weeks since her resignation. 4 weeks of yoga and plant care and long walks through Lincoln Park. 4 weeks of learning to exist without the constant pressure of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. The guilt had come as she had known it would. Some nights she lay awake thinking about the employees who had lost their jobs, the contracts that had been broken, the customers who had been left scrambling for alternatives. She thought about the drivers and dispatchers and warehouse workers who had done nothing wrong except work for a company run by people who valued loyalty over competence. She thought about whether she could have found another way, a path that didn't require so much collateral damage. But then she thought about 18 years of invisibility, about birthday cakes in the wrong flavor, about standing in a blizzard at 2 a.m. while her sister slept in silk sheets and her father took credit for her work. She thought about the recording device in her mother's purse, about the ultimatum in her father's study, about being told she was nothing without a family that had never seen her as anything more than a useful tool. The guilt was real, but so was the anger. And so was the knowledge that she had not caused this collapse. She had simply stopped preventing it. Her phone buzzed. "Marcus, can you meet? The situation has developed." She typed back, "Usual place." 1 hour. The usual place was no longer the Starlight Diner. That had been a one-time location chosen for its anonymity, useful for a conversation that needed to happen far from prying eyes. Now they met at a coffee shop in Wicker Park, a converted warehouse with exposed brick and industrial lighting, and baristas who took their craft far too seriously. It was the kind of place where no one from the Wellington world would ever set foot, which made it perfect. Marcus was already there when she arrived, sitting at a corner table with a stack of documents and an expression that hovered somewhere between professional concern and barely suppressed excitement. He stood as she approached, pulled out her chair, waited until she was seated before sliding a folder across the table. "The quarterly numbers," he said. "A contact at the bank sent them over this morning." Elena opened the folder, began reviewing the figures. Revenue down 12% from the same quarter last year. Operating expenses up 18%, driven largely by emergency contractor fees, penalty payments, and what was euphemistically labeled executive office improvements. By today. The measure of operating profitability that banks use to assess a company's ability to service its debt had fallen by 22%. "The debt service coverage ratio," she said, not a question. 1.03, down from 1.31 last quarter. Marcus leaned forward, tapped a line on the document. "The covenant threshold is 1.25. They're in violation." Elena studied the numbers, tracing the path of destruction through rows and columns. The contract penalties from the medical equipment delays accounted for nearly $300,000 in unexpected expenses. The routing system outage had added another $200,000 in emergency IT services and lost revenue from canceled shipments. Tiffany's office renovation had contributed its own $200,000 to the hemorrhage. And then there were the severance packages for the employees Robert had fired in his purge, the recruitment fees for their replacements, the training costs for people who had no idea how to do the jobs they had been hired into. 22%. In 1 quarter. It was almost impressive in a catastrophic sort of way. "When is the bank meeting?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock at First Chicago's downtown offices." Marcus pulled out another document, this one covered in dense legal text. "But that's not the worst of it. Look at this." Elena took the document, recognized it immediately. The original loan agreement from 7 years ago, the $40 million credit facility that had funded Wellington Logistics' expansion into the Midwest market. She had negotiated the terms herself, had spent weeks going back and forth with the bank's legal team, had eventually secured an interest rate 0.5 point below market by demonstrating the company's operational excellence. "Section 12.4, Marcus said. "Change of control." She turned to the relevant page, read the clause she already knew by heart. "Upon any transfer of 20% or more of the outstanding equity interests of the borrower to any party not listed in Schedule A, the lender shall have the right, at its sole discretion, to declare an event of default and accelerate all outstanding principal and accrued interest." "He never notified them," Elena said. "He never notified them." Marcus sat back in his chair, shook his head slowly. 49% transferred to Tiffany, and no one thought to check whether the bank needed to approve it first. Or maybe they checked and decided to do it anyway, hoping no one would notice. Someone noticed. The quarterly review, standard procedure. They pull the corporate filings, cross-reference against the loan documents, verify that nothing material has changed. Marcus picked up his coffee, took a long sip. Robert walked into a room full of bankers thinking they wanted to talk about cash flow, and instead they handed him a notice of default. Elena closed the folder, set it aside, wrapped her hands around her own coffee cup. The ceramic was warm against her palms, grounding her in the present moment, keeping her from floating away into the satisfaction that wanted to wash over her. "Tell me what happened," she said, "at the meeting." Marcus had not been in the room, of course. He was Elena's attorney, not the company's, and his presence would have raised questions no one wanted to answer. But he had sources, the same sources that had been feeding information to both of them since this entire situation began. and by the time he arrived at the coffee shop this morning, he had already assembled a detailed account of the previous day's events. Robert brought his CFO and his corporate counsel. The bank had 3 people: the relationship manager, the credit officer, and someone from their legal department. Marcus paused, arranged the details in his mind. It started normally enough. The relationship manager expressed concern about the quarterly numbers, asked for an explanation of the revenue decline and the expense increases. Robert apparently gave some speech about transitional challenges and new leadership learning curves. How did that go over? About as well as you'd expect. The credit officer pulled out the DSCR calculations, pointed out that they were in technical violation of the covenant, asked what remediation plans were in place. Marcus smiled grimly. That's when things got interesting. According to Marcus's source, the conversation had shifted when the bank's legal representative placed a single document on the conference table. A copy of the share transfer agreement, the same agreement Elena had signed in her father's study 4 weeks earlier, obtained through a routine check of corporate filings with the Illinois Secretary of State. Robert had apparently gone very still when he saw it. The bank's lawyer had spoken then, her voice calm and professional, explaining that the transfer of 49% of the company's equity to a new shareholder constituted a change of control event under Section 12.4 of the loan agreement. Such events required 30 days advance, written notice, and explicit lender consent. Neither had been provided. The bank was therefore within its rights to declare the loan in default and accelerate the full principal balance. Robert tried to argue it was an internal family transfer, Marcus said. Claimed it didn't count because Tiffany was already a shareholder. Tiffany owned 2%. Exactly. The bank's position is that going from 2% to 51% is a material change in control regardless of family relationships. The language in the agreement doesn't have a family exception. Marcus finished his coffee, set the cup aside. The meeting ended with the bank issuing a formal notice of default. Robert has 30 days to cure the violation or they'll exercise their remedies, which include acceleration of the full principal balance, freezing of the revolving credit facility, and if payment isn't made within the cure period, foreclosure on the collateral. Marcus met her eyes. The collateral includes the company's physical assets, the accounts receivable, and per a personal guarantee Robert signed when the loan was originated, his residence in Lake Forest. Elena absorbed this information, let it settle into place alongside everything else she knew. The house in Lake Forest. Her grandfather's house, the house her grandmother had hated, the house where she had grown up feeling invisible and inadequate, and never quite good enough. The house where her father had demanded she sign away her inheritance as a birthday gift. The credit facility, she said, that's their operating cash. $2 million revolving line. As of this morning, it's frozen. No draws permitted until the default is cured. Marcus pulled out his phone, checked a message that had just arrived. My source says payroll is due Friday. They don't have enough cash on hand to cover it. Friday. 3 days away. 3 days for a company to find several $100,000 in a bank account that was now locked, managed by executives who had never had to solve a problem without Elena doing the actual work. What about the fuel accounts? Elena asked. Same situation. The fleet fuel cards are tied to a credit line that's been suspended. Marcus shook his head. As of right now, Wellington Logistics has trucks sitting in lots across 6 states with no way to fill their tanks. Elena thought about those trucks, about the drivers who depended on them for their livelihoods, about the customers waiting for shipments that would never arrive, about the ripple effects spreading outward from her father's arrogance like waves from a stone dropped in still water. The guilt stirred again, familiar now, almost comfortable. She acknowledged it, set it aside, focused on the practical realities of the situation. What happens next? That depends on Robert. Marcus gathered his documents, slipped them back into his briefcase. He has 3 options. 1, he finds alternative financing to pay off the bank and cure the default. Given the company's current financial state and the change of control violation, that's unlikely. No legitimate lender is going to touch this. Option 2. He negotiates with the bank, tries to get them to waive the violation, restructure the loan, extend the cure period. But the bank has been looking for an exit from this relationship for over a year. They're not going to do him any favors. And option 3? Marcus was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. He finds someone to blame. Someone he can point to and say, this person sabotaged us. This person caused all our problems. We would be fine if not for them. He met Elena's eyes. Someone like you. Elena had expected this, had prepared for it in fact from the moment she signed those papers in her father's study. She knew her father knew how his mind worked, knew that he was constitutionally incapable of accepting responsibility for his own failures. When things went wrong, Robert Wellington found scapegoats. It was as fundamental to his nature as breathing. Let him try, she said. Elena. Marcus leaned forward, his voice serious. I know you've been careful. I know you followed every policy, every procedure, every legal requirement. But your father has resources. He has lawyers. He has 40 years of connections in this city. If he decides to come after you, then he comes after me. Elena finished her coffee, set down the cup with a soft click against the saucer. I didn't do anything wrong, Marcus. I signed documents he asked me to sign. I resigned from a job I was entitled to resign from. I followed security policies that he himself approved. If he wants to sue me for that, let him explain to a judge how his daughter following company policy constitutes sabotage. It could get ugly. It's already ugly. Elena stood, gathered her coat and purse. Keep me informed, and Marcus. She paused, looked down at him with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and determination. Thank you for everything. I'm just doing my job. No, you're doing considerably more than your job. She smiled, small and genuine. I won't forget it. She left the coffee shop, stepped out into the February afternoon, felt the cold air fill her lungs with something that felt almost like hope. The sky was gray, heavy with the promise of snow, but somewhere behind the clouds the sun was still shining. She walked home slowly, taking the long route through the park, past the frozen pond where children had been skating a few weeks earlier, past the bare trees that would bloom again in a few months, when winter finally released its grip on the city. She thought about her father sitting in his study, surrounded by the mounted heads of animals he had never actually hunted, watching his empire crumble around him. She thought about her sister probably still adding followers on the company TikTok account, oblivious to the catastrophe unfolding beyond the walls of her newly renovated office. She thought about the employees who would not get paid on Friday, about the drivers whose trucks sat empty and useless, about all the people who had nothing to do with the Wellington family's dysfunction but who would suffer the consequences nonetheless. The guilt rose again stronger this time, and she let it come. Let it wash over her. Let it remind her that her actions had consequences. Let it keep her honest about what she had done and why she had done it. She had not caused this, but she had allowed it to happen. She had seen the house of cards for what it was, had known exactly which cards to remove to bring the whole structure down, and she had removed them anyway. Not out of malice, not out of revenge, but out of the simple, terrible recognition that some things cannot be saved. Some things must be allowed to fall so that something better can rise from the ruins. Her phone buzzed as she reached the entrance to her building. Another message from Jennifer. Emergency all-hands meeting called for 4 p.m. Word is, Robert is going to announce something big. Elena read the message, typed back a simple acknowledgement, and went inside to wait. The announcement came 2 hours later, delivered via a company-wide email that Jennifer forwarded within minutes of its distribution. The email was from Robert's personal account, which meant he had written it himself, rather than delegating to communications staff, which meant he was angry enough to abandon all pretense of professional distance. The tone was aggressive defensive, the tone of a man looking for someone to attack because attacking was easier than admitting failure. The subject line read, Notice regarding former employee Elena Wellington. Elena read the email 3 times, slowly absorbing every word. It has come to management's attention that the recent operational challenges faced by Wellington Logistics were not the result of transitional difficulties or market conditions as previously believed. Instead, evidence has emerged that Elena Wellington, former chief operating officer, engaged in a deliberate campaign of sabotage prior to and following her departure from the company. This campaign included, but was not limited to, the intentional destruction of proprietary systems and data, the deliberate concealment of critical operational information, the improper solicitation of employees to competing firms, and the violation of fiduciary duties owed to the company and its shareholders. Wellington Logistics has retained legal counsel and will be pursuing all available remedies, including but not limited to civil action, for damages, injunctive relief, and referral to appropriate law enforcement authorities for investigation of potential criminal conduct. All employees are reminded of their confidentiality obligations and are prohibited from discussing company matters with Elena Wellington or anyone acting on her behalf. Violation of this directive will result in immediate termination. Robert J. Wellington, Chief Executive Officer. Elena set down her phone, walked to her window, looked out at the city spread below her. The first flakes of snow were beginning to fall, drifting down from the gray sky like confetti at a parade, celebrating nothing at all. Her father was going to sue her. Was probably already drafting the complaint, assembling his lawyers, preparing to drag her through the courts for months or years. He would claim she had sabotaged the company, that she had destroyed data and stolen employees and violated duties she had never owed him in the first place. He would use his connections and his resources and his 40 years of accumulated influence to make her life as difficult as possible. And he would lose. Elena knew this with absolute certainty, the same certainty she had felt standing in that container yard at 2 a.m, reciting customs codes to a bureaucrat who didn't want to listen. She had been careful. She had followed every rule, every policy, every legal requirement. She had documentation for everything, copies of every email, records of every decision. Her father could throw his lawyers at her until the money ran out, and in the end, he would have nothing. But he would try. Because trying was all he had left. Because admitting that he had destroyed his own company through arrogance and greed and the systematic undervaluing of the one person who had held it together was simply not something Robert Wellington was capable of. Her phone buzzed again. Marcus. I saw the email. We need to talk. Tonight. Elena typed back. My apartment. 7 o'clock. Then she set down the phone, poured herself a glass of wine, and sat down to wait for the next move in a chess game her father didn't even realize he had already lost. The offices of Hartwell Logistics occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower on Wacker Drive, a building so aggressively modern that it seemed to be actively rejecting the architectural heritage of the city around it. Elena arrived at 9:45, 15 minutes early for her 10 o'clock interview, wearing a navy Stella McCartney suit she had bought for herself 3 days after her resignation as a small act of rebellion against a lifetime of dressing for other people's approval. The lobby was all white marble and chrome fixtures, staffed by a receptionist who smiled with professional warmth and offered her a choice of sparkling or still water. Elena chose still, accepted the glass, and settled into a leather chair to review her notes while she waited. The interview had been arranged through connections, former colleagues who had landed at Hartwell in the weeks following her departure, people who had seen her work firsthand and knew what she was capable of. The position was Vice President of Operations, a step down from her previous title, but a step up in terms of actual authority. Hartwell was smaller than Wellington, more agile, run by people who valued competence over pedigree. It was exactly the kind of opportunity she had been hoping for. She was reviewing the company's recent quarterly report when the elevator doors opened and 2 men in dark suits stepped into the lobby. They moved with the particular purposefulness of people who were not there to conduct business, in the conventional sense, their eyes scanning the room until they found her. Elena Wellington. She knew what was happening before the words were fully out of his mouth. The manila envelope in his hand, the official bearing the way the receptionist's smile faltered as she realized something unusual was occurring. Elena set down her water glass, stood, and faced the men with the composure of someone who had been expecting this moment for weeks. I'm Elena Wellington. You've been served. The first man thrust the envelope into her hands, his voice flat and practiced. Civil complaint filed in the Circuit Court of Cook County. You're named as defendant. The second man produced a separate document, thinner, a single page that he held out with the same mechanical efficiency. Notice of prejudgment attachment. Pursuant to court order, your personal bank accounts have been temporarily frozen pending resolution of the matter. Elena took both documents, tucked them under her arm without looking at them. Is there anything else? The men exchanged glances, apparently surprised by her lack of reaction. Most people, when served with a $10 million lawsuit, exhibited some form of distress. Shock, anger, tears, demands for explanation. Elena offered them nothing but polite attention. That's all, ma'am. Have a good day. They retreated to the elevator, left her standing in the marble lobby with the weight of legal documents pressing against her ribs. The receptionist was staring at her with barely concealed curiosity. Somewhere behind the frosted glass walls of the executive suite, people who might have been her future colleagues were going about their morning routines, unaware of the drama unfolding in their waiting area. Elena sat back down, opened the envelope, and began to read. Wellington Logistics Incorporated versus Elena Marie Wellington. Complaint for breach of fiduciary duty, intentional interference with business relations, computer fraud and abuse, conversion of corporate assets, and civil conspiracy. Damages sought in the amount of $10 million plus punitive damages, attorney's fees, and costs. She turned to the next page, then the next, scanning the allegations with the same analytical detachment she brought to contract negotiations. The complaint painted a picture of calculated destruction of an executive who had spent years positioning herself to sabotage the company that employed her, who had systematically deleted critical data, changed passwords, and recruited key employees to competitors in a coordinated campaign of corporate espionage. The allegations were absurd, of course. Every action attributed to her malicious intent was in fact the natural consequence of standard corporate procedures. Procedures her father had approved without reading policies she had implemented to protect the company from exactly the kind of chaos that would result from poor succession planning. But absurdity had never stopped her father before. He had money lawyers and an absolute conviction in his own righteousness. He would throw all of it at her, not because he expected to win, but because fighting was easier than admitting he had lost. The prejudgment attachment was more concerning. Her accounts frozen her access to her own money, restricted, all based on a complaint that hadn't even been heard by a judge yet. Her father's lawyers had convinced someone on the bench that she represented a flight risk, that she might liquidate her assets and disappear before the case could be resolved. It was a temporary measure, technically one that Marcus could probably get lifted within a few weeks, but in the meantime she was effectively paralyzed, unable to pay rent, or buy groceries, or do any of the mundane things that required access to a bank account. "Ms. Wellington." She looked up. The receptionist was approaching, her professional smile replaced by an expression of genuine sympathy. "Your 10 o'clock appointment has been rescheduled. Mr. Hartwell sends his apologies, but given the circumstances..." She trailed off, gesturing vaguely toward the documents in Elena's lap. Given the circumstances. Of course. News traveled fast in the logistics industry. By noon, everyone who mattered would know that Elena Wellington had been sued by her own father, accused of sabotage and fraud and conspiracy. The interview had been dead from the moment those process servers stepped off the elevator. "I understand." Elena gathered the documents, stood smooth the front of her suit. "Please thank Mr. Hartwell for his time." She walked out of the building with her head held high, ignoring the stares of the security guards and the whispered speculation of the people waiting for elevators. Outside, the February wind cut through her coat, carrying with it the smell of snow and diesel exhaust, and the particular urban grit that was uniquely Chicago. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the cold clear her head, then pulled out her phone and called Marcus. "I've been served," she said when he answered. $10 million, plus they froze my accounts." A long pause on the other end. "Where are you?" "Wacker Drive. I was supposed to have a job interview." The circumstances changed. She started walking toward the nearest L station, her heels clicking against the frozen pavement. "I need you to file an emergency motion to lift the attachment. I have bills due next week and roughly $47 in cash." "I'll have it filed by end of day. Can you come to my office? We need to strategize." "On my way." She ended the call, descended into the underground station, and caught the next train heading north. The car was mostly empty at this hour, just a few other passengers scattered along the orange plastic seats, lost in their phones, or their thoughts, or the particular vacancy that came from riding public transit in the middle of a workday. Elena found a seat by the window, watched the tunnel walls blur past, and allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. Her father was trying to destroy her, not just defeat her, not just punish her for her defiance, but systematically dismantle everything she had built over 18 years of work, her reputation, her finances, her future. He wanted her to understand that leaving the Wellington orbit came with consequences, that no one walked away from Robert Wellington without paying a price. The train emerged from the tunnel, rose onto the elevated tracks, and suddenly she could see the city spread out around her, gray and cold and indifferent to her troubles. Somewhere out there, her father was probably celebrating his tactical victory, raising a glass of expensive scotch to the lawyers who had convinced a judge to freeze his daughter's bank accounts. Somewhere out there, her mother was probably wringing her hands and asking why Elena had to be so difficult, why she couldn't just apologize and make this all go away. Somewhere out there, her sister was probably posting selfies from her newly renovated office, oblivious to the wreckage she was standing in the middle of. Elena closed her eyes, leaned her head against the cold window glass, and let the rhythm of the train carry her toward whatever came next. Marcus's office was on the 14th floor of a building in the Loop, a small firm that specialized in commercial litigation and had earned a reputation for taking on cases that larger firms considered too risky or too complicated. The waiting room was modest, functional, decorated with framed certificates and photographs of Marcus, shaking hands with various satisfied clients. Elena had been here a dozen times over the past 6 weeks, but today the familiar surroundings felt different, charged with a new urgency. She spent 3 hours with Marcus going over the complaint, analyzing each allegation, identifying the weaknesses in her father's case. The breach of fiduciary duty claim was the most serious, the assertion that she had owed a duty of loyalty to the company and had violated it by prioritizing her own interests over the interests of shareholders. But the argument had a fatal flaw. Elena had not been a fiduciary at the time of her alleged misconduct. She had resigned before the routing system crashed, before the customs delays, before any of the events her father was claiming as evidence of sabotage. "He's arguing that your resignation itself was an act of sabotage," Marcus explained, highlighting a passage in the complaint. "That you timed your departure to cause maximum damage knowing the company would collapse without you. That's not illegal. Employees are allowed to resign." Employees are allowed to resign, yes, but fiduciaries have additional obligations. They're supposed to ensure smooth transitions to train successors to protect the interests of shareholders even after departure. Marcus set down the document, met her eyes. "His lawyers are trying to argue that your status as COO and your ownership stake created fiduciary duties that survived your resignation. That's a stretch. It's a massive stretch, but it's not frivolous enough to get dismissed outright, which means we have to litigate it." Marcus pulled out a legal pad, began making notes. "The computer fraud allegations are easier to defeat. The IT policy you cited is a matter of record. Your father signed it. The automatic deletion of user credentials upon separation is explicitly described in Section 4.7. There's no way a jury concludes that following documented company policy constitutes computer fraud." "What about the attachment? Can you get it lifted?" "I've already drafted the motion. We'll argue that there's no evidence of flight risk, no indication that you're planning to dissipate assets. You're a lifelong Chicago resident with strong community ties. The attachment was improper and should be vacated." He paused. "But Elena, even if we win on the motion, this case is going to take months to resolve. Maybe years if your father decides to drag it out." "He'll drag it out as long as he can afford to." Elena stood, walked to the window, looked out at the gray cityscape. "This isn't about winning. It's about punishment. He wants to make me suffer, make me spend every dollar I have on legal fees, make me unemployable while the case is pending. Even if I win in the end, he wins in the middle. Then we need to change the game." Marcus stood, joined her at the window. "We need to give him something else to worry about." Elena turned, met his eyes. "What did you have in mind?" "A counterclaim. Not just defending ourselves, but attacking him. Put him on the defensive. Force him to spend his resources protecting himself instead of prosecuting you." "On what grounds?" Marcus smiled the smile of a lawyer who had been waiting for exactly this question. "Your former colleagues have been very helpful over the past few weeks." "Very helpful. Jennifer in particular has been forwarding me documents that paint an interesting picture of how Wellington Logistics has been managed." He walked to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a thick folder. "Corporate credit card statements. Specifically, your sister's corporate credit card statements. Over the past 6 weeks, Tiffany has charged approximately $347,000 in personal expenses to the company account. Designer handbags, first-class flights to Paris, a spa weekend in Scottsdale, a down payment on a Mercedes convertible." He flipped through the pages. "None of it authorized by the board, none of it disclosed to shareholders, none of it remotely connected to legitimate business purposes. That's embezzlement. It's conversion of corporate assets at minimum, potentially criminal fraud if we can show intent." Marcus set down the folder. But that's just the beginning. I've also obtained copies of the company's tax filings for the past 3 years. There are some discrepancies. Deductions claimed for business expenses that appear to be personal. Depreciation schedules that don't match the actual asset valuations. Nothing that screams fraud on its face, but enough irregularities to warrant investigation. Elena processed this information, turning it over in her mind, like pieces of a puzzle she was only beginning to see. You want to countersue Robert for tax fraud and misuse of company funds. I want to give him a reason to reconsider this litigation. Right now, he thinks he's the aggressor and you're the victim. He thinks he can throw resources at you until you break. But if he's also a defendant, if he's facing allegations that could result in personal liability, maybe even criminal referral. Marcus shrugged. Suddenly, this lawsuit looks a lot less attractive. Do we have enough evidence? We have enough to file. We have enough to survive a motion to dismiss. Whether we have enough to win at trial, he trailed off. But that's not really the point, is it? The point is leverage. The point is making him understand that this war has 2 fronts, and he can't afford to fight on both of them. Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the city that had been her home for 38 years. The city where she had built a career, lost a family, discovered who she really was when everything she thought she knew was stripped away. She thought about her father, about the man who had raised her to be invisible and useful and perpetually inadequate. She thought about the satisfaction he must have felt when he filed this lawsuit, the pleasure of finally having a target for all the rage that had been building since she walked out of his house 6 weeks ago. She thought about fighting back. Do it, she said. File the counterclaim. Let him see what it feels like to be on the defensive. Marcus nodded, already making notes. I'll have the papers ready by tomorrow. In the meantime, you should go home, get some rest. The next few weeks are going to be... His phone rang, interrupting whatever he had been about to say. He glanced at the screen, frowned, answered with a curt, Chen here. Elena watched his expression shift as he listened, from curiosity to surprise to something that looked almost like disbelief. Who told you this? A pause. No, don't send it to my office email. Use the secure channel. Yes, the same one as before. Another pause, longer this time. How certain are you? Because if this is accurate... He trailed off, shook his head. Fine, send it. I'll review it tonight. He ended the call, set down the phone, and stared at it for a moment as if expecting it to ring again. What was that? Elena asked. One of my contacts at the company, someone in the IT department who's been helpful with recovering deleted files. Marcus looked up at her, his expression strange. She found something in the backup servers, an email chain from 7 years ago, around the time the original loan agreement was negotiated. What kind of email chain? The kind that discusses the terms of a personal guarantee. Marcus picked up his phone again, began scrolling. Your father signed a personal guarantee when First Chicago agreed to the $40 million credit facility. The bank wanted additional security given the size of the loan. Robert agreed to pledge his personal assets as collateral. Elena felt something shift in her chest. I remember. I was in the room when he signed it. Do you remember what he pledged? The usual. Personal financial statements, a lien on his brokerage accounts. She paused, tried to pull the memory from the depths of 18 years of accumulated details. And something else. Something about real estate. The Lake Forest house. Marcus's voice was quiet, almost reverent. According to this email chain, Robert pledged his primary residence as collateral for the loan. If Wellington Logistics defaults and the company assets aren't sufficient to cover the outstanding balance, the bank has the right to foreclose on the house. Elena stared at him. He forgot. It was 7 years ago. A lot has happened since then. Marcus set down his phone. But Elena, do you understand what this means? The bank has already declared the company in default. They've frozen the credit facilities. They're preparing to call the entire loan. If they do that and the company can't pay, they'll take his house. Elena finished the sentence, feeling the weight of it settle into her bones. Everything. The house his father built, the house he raised us in, the house he was so desperate to pass on to Tiffany. Gone, unless he can somehow pay off the entire loan balance, which, given the company's current financial state, is essentially impossible. Elena walked back to the window, pressed her palm against the cold glass, watched her breath fog the surface. She thought about the study in Lake Forest, the mounted animal heads and leather furniture, and the desk where her father had demanded she sign away her inheritance. She thought about walking into that room as a child, being told to wait quietly while her father conducted important business, being trained from the earliest age to be invisible and unobtrusive, and never ever to cause trouble. She thought about the man who had built his entire identity around that house, around the wealth it represented, around the legacy he believed it embodied. A legacy built on her grandmother's work, maintained by her own labor, sustained by the people her father had never bothered to see or thank or value. All of it balanced on a piece of paper he had signed 7 years ago and promptly forgotten. "He doesn't know," she said quietly. "He must have known at the time, but people forget, especially people who are used to having others handle the details for them." Elena turned from the window, faced Marcus. "Don't tell him." "What?" "Don't include this in the counterclaim. Don't mention it in any filing. Don't let him know that we know about the personal guarantee." She crossed the room, sat down in the chair across from his desk. "Let him keep thinking the worst that can happen is he loses the company. Let him keep fighting this lawsuit, spending money he doesn't have, believing he can still win. And when the bank finally forecloses, when they come for everything, he won't see it coming? He never sees anything coming." Elena's voice was flat, empty of triumph or satisfaction. "That's always been his problem. He's so focused on what he wants to happen that he can't see what's actually happening right in front of him." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. "Elena, are you sure about this? We're talking about your father losing his home, the place where you grew up. The place where I grew up, being told I was nothing. The place where I was trained to be invisible. The place where he sat me down on my 38th birthday and told me to give away everything I had earned because my sister needed it more." Elena met his eyes without flinching. "I didn't take that house from him, Marcus. I didn't even take the company. He did all of this himself. I'm just letting him. The bank is going to move forward regardless of what we do." "Exactly. This isn't revenge. Revenge would require me to do something. I'm doing nothing." She stood, gathered her coat and purse. "I'm going home. Call me when you've filed the counterclaim." She was almost to the door when something made her stop, turn back. "Marcus, the email chain. The one about the personal guarantee." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Who sent it? Who was involved in that conversation?" Marcus scrolled through his phone, found the information. "Robert, obviously. The CFO at the time, a man named Harrison who retired 3 years ago. The bank's relationship manager." He paused. "And one other person. Someone who was copied on every message, who participated in the negotiations, who witnessed Robert sign the guarantee." "Who?" Marcus met her eyes. "You. You were copied on all of it. You were in the room when he signed." Elena nodded slowly, absorbing the information. She had been there. She had seen him sign. She had filed away the details in her memory in the vast archive of institutional knowledge that lived only in her head, knowledge that had walked out the door with her the day she resigned. Her father had forgotten. She had not. "Good night, Marcus." "Good night, Elena." She left the office, descended to the street, and walked home through the cold February evening. The lawsuit, the frozen accounts, the counterclaim, the personal guarantee. All the pieces were in motion now, spinning toward a conclusion that felt both inevitable and impossibly far away. Her father thought he was attacking her, thought he was the hunter, and she was the prey. He had no idea that he had stepped into a trap of his own, making a trap that had been set 7 years ago in a conference room where a young woman sat quietly in the corner, watching and listening and remembering. The cold bit at her cheeks as she walked. The city hummed with its usual indifference to individual suffering. And somewhere in Lake Forest, a man who had never learned to see the people around him was about to discover what it felt like to be invisible. She arrived home just after 6, exhausted from a day that had started with a job interview and ended with the knowledge that her entire family was about to collapse. She hung up her coat, kicked off her shoes, and was heading toward the kitchen to pour herself a much-needed glass of wine when the doorbell rang. Elena froze. No one visited without calling first. Not Marcus, not Jennifer, not any of the former colleagues who had become her primary social contacts over the past weeks. The only people who showed up unannounced were process servers, and she had already been served everything worth serving. She approached the door cautiously, looked through the peephole. Her mother stood in the hallway wearing a camel-colored coat that Elena recognized from Christmases past. Her silver blonde hair perfectly styled her face, arranged in an expression of maternal concern that was almost convincing. Elena did not open the door. She stood there, hand on the knob, trying to understand what this visit meant. Her mother had not contacted her since the night of the birthday dinner. No calls, no texts, no emails. 6 weeks of absolute silence from the woman who had raised her, who had watched her husband demand the impossible and said nothing to defend her daughter. "Elena," Margaret's voice came muffled through the door. "Sweetheart, please, I know you're home. Can we talk?" Against her better judgment. Elena unlocked the door and opened it. "Mom?" "Oh, honey." Margaret stepped forward, wrapped her arms around Elena in a hug that smelled of Chanel No. 5 and desperation. "I've been so worried about you. This whole situation, this lawsuit, I couldn't stay away any longer. I had to see you, had to make sure you were all right." Elena stood stiff in her mother's embrace, not returning it, waiting for the moment to pass. When Margaret finally released her, she stepped back, gestured toward the living room with a hospitality that felt more like habit than genuine welcome. "Come in." Margaret entered the apartment, her eyes scanning the space with the particular attention of someone cataloging everything she saw. The plants on the windowsill now thriving after weeks of proper care. The yoga mat still unrolled in the corner. The small stack of books on the coffee table, titles about negotiation and corporate strategy and the psychology of difficult families. "It's nice," Margaret said, settling onto the couch. "Smaller than I expected, but nice. You've made it very cozy." "What are you doing here, Mom?" Margaret's face shifted through several expressions, finally settling on something that approximated hurt. "Can't a mother visit her daughter? I told you I've been worried. This lawsuit, everything your father is saying." She reached out, took Elena's hand. "I know it's not true. I know you would never do the things he's accusing you of. I wanted you to know that I believe you." Elena looked at her mother's hand clasped around her own. The perfectly manicured nails, the diamond ring that had been a 20th anniversary gift, the skin that was softer than it should have been thanks to decades of expensive creams and weekly spa treatments. She thought about all the times those hands had failed to protect her, all the moments when her mother could have intervened and chose instead to look away. "Thank you," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "I've been trying to talk to your father, trying to make him see reason. But you know how he is when he gets an idea in his head. So stubborn." Margaret sighed, a practiced exhalation of maternal frustration. "I keep telling him Elena isn't the enemy. She's our daughter, but he's so angry, so hurt by everything that's happened. He's hurt. He feels betrayed. The resignation, the way you left, the things you said." Margaret squeezed her hand. "I'm not saying he's right. I'm just saying try to see it from his perspective. He spent 35 years building that company, and now it's falling apart. He needs someone to blame." "So he blames me. He blames circumstances. He blames timing. He blames—" Margaret paused, seemed to consider her words carefully. "He blames himself deep down. He would never admit it, but he knows things could have been handled differently. We all could have handled things differently." Elena watched her mother's face as she spoke, watched the careful construction of each sentence, the way her eyes flickered to the left and down when she said certain words. Her mother was lying. Not about everything, but about something. There was an agenda here, a purpose beyond simple maternal concern. And then she noticed it. The slight bulge in her mother's purse resting on the couch cushion beside her. The particular shape of it, rectangular and hard-edged, too angular to be a wallet or a phone case. The way her mother's left hand rested protectively on the purse strap, fingers curled around it with a tension that belied her casual posture. Elena's stomach went cold. "Mom," she said, keeping her voice light. "Can I get you something to drink? Tea water?" "Water would be lovely." Elena stood, walked to the kitchen, filled a glass from the tap. She took her time, letting her back stay turned to the living room, giving herself space to think. Her mother had come here with a recording device in her purse. Her mother was gathering evidence for her father's lawsuit. Her mother, who claimed to believe her, who claimed to be worried about her, was trying to capture her words on tape. She thought about the birthday dinner, about the recording device she had noticed in her mother's purse that night before everything had fallen apart. She had suspected it, then had seen the guilt in her mother's eyes, had chosen not to confront it, because she was already overwhelmed with other confrontations. She would not make that choice again. Elena carried the water glass back to the living room, set it on the coffee table in front of her mother, and sat down in the chair across from her, rather than returning to her spot on the couch. "Mom," she said, "I need to ask you something." "Anything, sweetheart." "Why are you really here?" Margaret's smile flickered, recovered. "I told you. I was worried. I wanted to see you." "You've had 6 weeks to worry. 6 weeks to call to text to show up at my door." Elena kept her voice steady, conversational. "Why tonight? Why now, on the same day I was served with a lawsuit and had my accounts frozen?" "I didn't know about the lawsuit until your father told me this evening. That's why I came. I was upset. I wanted to make sure you were okay." "And the recording device in your purse?" The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret's face went through a rapid succession of expressions: surprise, confusion, denial, and finally resignation. Her hand tightened on the purse strap, then relaxed, as if she had realized that further pretense was pointless. "Elena, give it to me." "Sweetheart, you don't understand. Your father asked me to—" "Give it to me." Margaret sat frozen for a long moment, caught between loyalties that had been pulling at her for 40 years. Then slowly she reached into her purse and withdrew a small digital recorder, sleek and black and damning. She held it out to Elena, her hand trembling slightly. Elena took the device, examined it. The red light was on, indicating it was actively recording. She turned it over in her hands, feeling its weight, thinking about all the words it had captured, all the evidence her mother had been trying to gather for a case designed to destroy her. Without a word, she picked up the water glass from the coffee table, dropped the recorder into it, and watched it sink to the bottom. "Elena, please." Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "I didn't want to do it. Your father insisted. He said it was the only way to protect the family." "Protect the family." Elena set down the glass, watched bubbles rise from the drowning electronics. "Is that what you tell yourself, that you're protecting the family?" "Everything I've done has been for this family. Everything. Everything you've done has been for Robert." Elena looked at her mother. Really looked at her, seeing for perhaps the first time the woman Margaret had become over 40 years of marriage. The carefully maintained appearance, the practiced smiles, the willingness to sacrifice anything and anyone to maintain the illusion of a happy family. "You've never protected me. Not once. Not when he ignored me, not when he belittled me, not when he demanded I give away my inheritance. And now you come here with a recording device in your purse, trying to help him destroy me in court. He's my husband. I'm your daughter." The words hung between them, heavy with the weight of all the years they represented, all the birthday cakes in the wrong flavor, all the achievements that were never celebrated, all the moments when a mother could have chosen her child and chose instead to look away. Margaret's eyes were wet now, tears threatening to spill over onto her perfectly made-up cheeks. "I love you, Elena. I've always loved you." "No." Elena stood, walked to the front door, opened it. "You loved the idea of me, the useful daughter, the reliable one, the one who would always do what she was told. But me, the actual person with actual feelings and actual needs." She shook her head. "You've never even seen me." "That's not true." "It's the truest thing either of us has said tonight." Elena gestured toward the open door. "Leave." "Elena, please, let's talk about this. Let me explain." "There's nothing to explain. And there's nothing to talk about." Elena met her mother's eyes, held them, let her see the finality written there. "You chose your side, Mom. You chose it 40 years ago, and you've been choosing it every day since. I don't blame you for it anymore. I don't even hate you for it. But I'm done pretending we're family." Margaret stood, gathered her purse, walked to the door, on legs that seemed uncertain of their purpose. At the threshold, she turned back, one last appeal in her eyes. "I'm still your mother." "No." Elena's voice was quiet, almost gentle. "You're the woman who raised me. That's not the same thing." She closed the door, locked it, leaned against it for a moment, feeling the solid wood against her back, letting it hold her up while the last threads of connection to her former life snapped and fell away. She had told Marcus that this wasn't revenge, and it wasn't. This was something simpler and more painful. This was just the truth finally spoken aloud, finally acknowledged, finally real. She had no family anymore. No father, no mother, no sister. Just herself standing alone in an apartment she could barely afford, with frozen bank accounts and a $10 million lawsuit and a future that was entirely uncertain. But for the first time in 38 years, she was free. She walked to the kitchen, poured herself that glass of wine she had been wanting, and sat down at her table to wait for whatever came next. March arrived in Chicago the way it always did, with false promises of spring and sudden reminders that winter had not yet finished its work. The temperatures rose for a few days, melting the worst of the accumulated snow, and then plunged again as another cold front swept down from Canada, freezing everything into a treacherous layer of ice that made the sidewalks dangerous and the roads worse. Elena watched the weather from her apartment window, tracking the patterns with the same detached interest she brought to tracking the collapse of Wellington logistics. Both were forces of nature in their way. Both followed predictable trajectories. And both would eventually run their course, leaving behind wreckage for others to clean up. The updates from Jennifer had become almost daily now, each one painting another detail in the portrait of a company in its death throes. Week 8, after her resignation. The routing system had been restored finally after the IT vendor completed their emergency access protocol and charged the company $47,000 for the privilege. But the damage was done. 3 major clients had terminated their contracts during the outage, taking with them nearly $4 million in annual revenue. 2 more were in negotiations with competitors, their loyalty exhausted by weeks of missed deliveries and broken promises. Week 9. The drivers went on strike. Not all of them, not officially, but enough to matter. 23 of the company's 68 drivers simply stopped showing up for work, citing unpaid overtime and the general chaos that had consumed operations since Elena's departure. The union filed grievances. The labor board opened an investigation. The remaining drivers, the ones still loyal or still desperate enough to keep working, found themselves stretched across routes that had been designed for twice their number. Week 10. Tiffany's credit card was finally cut off, not by choice, but by necessity. The company's cash reserves had dwindled to the point where every expenditure had to be scrutinized, and even Robert could no longer justify his daughter's spending when there wasn't enough money to pay for fuel. Tiffany's response, according to Jennifer, had been a screaming match in the executive hallway that ended with her throwing a Hermes bag at her father's head and storming out of the building. She had not returned to the office since. Week 11. Robert sold his Mercedes. The silver S-Class that had been his daily driver for 3 years, the car that had waited at the curb every morning to carry him from Lake Forest to the downtown office, traded in at a dealership for $73,000 in cash. The money went directly to First Chicago Bank, a partial payment on the accumulating interest that the company could no longer cover from operating revenue. It bought them another 2 weeks, maybe 3. Elena absorbed each update with the same careful attention she had once given to quarterly reports, filing the information away in her mind, building a picture of the battlefield even as she remained far from the front lines. She was not involved. She was not responsible. She was simply watching, waiting, letting gravity do its work. But gravity, it turned out, was not content to work alone. The social media attacks began in week 12, 3 days after the Mercedes was sold, 2 days after Robert was photographed driving a leased Toyota Camry into the Wellington parking garage. Someone had posted the photo on Twitter with a caption that read, "How the mighty have fallen," and the image had spread through the Chicago business community like wildfire. Robert Wellington, the man who had built his identity around wealth and success and the appearance of effortless superiority, reduced to driving a car that cost less than his monthly wine budget. His response was predictable. When Robert felt humiliated, he looked for someone to blame, and since he couldn't attack the anonymous Twitter users who were mocking him, he attacked the person he held responsible for his humiliation. The posts appeared on LinkedIn first, then Facebook, then the company's official Twitter account. Long, rambling screeds about betrayal and sabotage, about ungrateful employees who turned against the families that had nurtured them, about the decline of loyalty and the rise of selfishness in American business culture. He named Elena, directly accused her of crimes she had not committed, painted her as a villain in a story where he was the innocent victim. Elena's former colleagues sent her screenshots. Marcus sent her legal analyses pointing out the defamatory statements the grounds for additional lawsuits if she chose to pursue them. Jennifer sent her messages of support along with the information that most people inside the company knew the posts were lies, that Robert's credibility had collapsed along with everything else. Elena read it all, saved it all, responded to none of it. She had learned over 18 years of working with difficult people that the worst thing you could do to someone desperate for a reaction was to give them one. Robert wanted her to fight back, wanted her to engage, wanted the satisfaction of a battle he could pretend to be winning. Her silence was more devastating than any response could have been. Besides, she had other things to occupy her time. The counterclaim Marcus had filed was working its way through the court system slowly but steadily. The motion to lift the prejudgment attachment had been granted, restoring access to her bank accounts, freeing her from the financial paralysis her father had tried to impose. She had even received a few job inquiries from companies that had heard about her situation and wanted to hear her side of the story before the courts decided which version was true. She turned them all down politely but firmly. She was not ready to return to work. Not yet. Not while the siege was still in progress. The meeting request came on a Thursday afternoon, delivered via email from a law firm she did not recognize. Wellington and Associates Attorneys at Law. The name would have been almost funny if it hadn't been so predictable. Her father had finally found lawyers willing to put his name on their letterhead, probably in exchange for a percentage of whatever they could extract from this mess. The email was formal, professional, devoid of the vitriol that characterized Robert's personal communications. It proposed a settlement conference, a meeting between the parties and their counsel to explore whether the litigation could be resolved without further expense and acrimony. A neutral location was suggested, a conference room at the Chicago Marriott downtown. A date and time were proposed 2 days from now, Saturday at 10 in the morning. Elena forwarded the email to Marcus with a single question mark. His response came an hour later. They are desperate. The bank is closing in. Robert needs a way out and he is running out of options. We should take the meeting if only to see what they are offering. She typed back. And if I am not interested in what they are offering, then we will have learned something useful about how desperate they really are. Elena considered this, weighed the options, made her decision. Tell them we will be there. The conference room at the Marriott was aggressively neutral, beige walls and beige carpet and beige chairs arranged around a table that could have been lifted from any business hotel in any city in the world. The kind of room designed to be forgotten the moment you left it, a blank space where difficult conversations could happen without the distraction of personality or style. Elena arrived at 9:45 with Marcus at her side, both of them dressed in the professional armor of dark suits and serious expressions. They took seats on one side of the table, arranged their documents, accepted coffee from a hotel employee who seemed nervous about the tension already filling the room. At 10 o'clock exactly, the door opened and Robert Wellington entered. He looked older than Elena remembered. The 6 weeks since she had seen him in his study demanding she sign away her inheritance had added years to his face. His silver hair, usually swept back with product and precision, was slightly disheveled. His suit, though expensive, hung on his frame as if he had lost weight. The confidence that had always radiated from him like heat from a furnace was still there, but diminished, flickering like a fire running low on fuel. Behind him came 2 lawyers, a man and a woman Elena did not recognize, both carrying the particular expression of professionals who were not entirely sure they wanted to be associated with their client. They took seats across the table, arranged their own documents, exchanged pleasantries that were not pleasant at all. "Thank you for coming," the male lawyer began. His name was Davidson, according to the business card he had placed on the table. "My client appreciates the opportunity to discuss resolution of this matter." "We are here to listen," Marcus said. "That is all we have committed to." Of course. Davidson glanced at Robert, received some unspoken signal, continued. "As you know, the litigation between the parties has been costly for everyone involved. Legal fees, management distraction, reputational damage. We believe it would be in everyone's interest to find a path forward that does not require years of courtroom warfare." "What are you proposing?" Davidson opened a folder, pulled out a document, slid it across the table. "A comprehensive settlement. The company withdraws its lawsuit against Ms. Wellington. Ms. Wellington withdraws her counterclaims. All parties sign mutual releases agreeing not to pursue any further legal action related to these matters." Marcus picked up the document, began reading. Elena watched her father, who had not yet spoken, who was staring at her across the table with an expression she could not quite read. Anger, certainly. That was always there. But something else underneath it, something that might have been fear. "And in exchange for these mutual releases," Marcus asked, "Ms. Wellington agrees to return to Wellington Logistics in an operational capacity, interim COO reporting directly to the board. She will work to stabilize the company's operations, restore client confidence, and address the current financial challenges." Davidson paused, seemed to be choosing his next words carefully. "Compensation would be negotiated separately, but the company is prepared to be generous. Stock options, performance bonuses, a clear path to executive leadership once the crisis has passed." Elena said nothing. She let the proposal sit on the table, let the silence stretch, let her father's lawyers grow uncomfortable with the absence of response. "This is a good offer," Davidson continued, his voice taking on a note of forced enthusiasm. "A return to a position of authority, vindication of your professional reputation, the opportunity to rebuild what was lost. Everyone wins." "Everyone," Elena finally spoke, her voice quiet. "Does Tiffany return the shares she received? Does my father admit that the accusations he made were false? Does the company compensate the employees who were fired because of me? The ones who lost their jobs because my father decided to purge anyone he suspected of loyalty to his daughter?" Davidson's smile faltered. "The settlement does not include those specific provisions, no, but then it is not a settlement. It is a request for me to return to unpaid servitude while my family keeps everything they took from me." "Elena." Robert spoke for the first time, his voice rough around the edges, as if the words were being dragged from somewhere deep. "You have to understand the situation. The company is dying. Without you, it will not survive another month. Whatever happened between us, whatever was said, you cannot want to see your grandmother's legacy destroyed." "My grandmother's legacy?" Elena met her father's eyes, held them. "You invoked grandmother when you asked me to sign over my shares. You invoked her when you told me I was nothing without this family. You do not get to invoke her now when you need something from me. This is not about what I need. This is about the company, the employees, the customers who depend on us." "The employees you fired to punish me, the customers who left because you could not deliver on your contracts?" Elena shook her head slowly. "You did this, Robert. You and Tiffany and everyone who enabled you. I am not going to fix it for you." "Then what do you want?" Robert's voice was rising, the veneer of reasonableness cracking to reveal the anger underneath. "Name your price. What will it take to make you come back?" Elena was quiet for a long moment. She looked at her father, at the man who had raised her to be invisible, who had demanded everything and offered nothing, who was now sitting across from her in a beige conference room begging for her help. She thought about all the years she had spent trying to earn his approval, all the sacrifices she had made, all the parts of herself she had buried to become the daughter he never wanted but always needed. "I do not want to come back," she said. "I want to buy the company." Silence. Complete, absolute silence. "Excuse me." Davidson looked from Elena to Marcus to Robert, his face a mask of confusion. "You want to buy Wellington Logistics, all of it. The assets, the contracts, the brand." Elena reached into her briefcase, pulled out a document she had prepared the night before, slid it across the table. "Here is my offer." Robert picked up the document, began reading. His face went through a series of expressions, confusion, disbelief, and finally rage. He looked up at Elena, and she could see the fury building behind his eyes like a storm-gathering force. $1. $1 for the equity, plus assumption of all outstanding debt, including the bank loan and any other obligations currently on the books. Elena kept her voice level, professional. "Given the company's current financial state, that is a generous offer. The alternative is bankruptcy, which would result in liquidation of assets at fire sale prices and nothing for the current shareholders. You want me to sell you my company for $1. I want you to sell me my grandmother's company, the company she built, that you inherited, that you have spent the past 35 years running into the ground." Elena leaned forward, her voice dropping to something almost intimate. "You can keep fighting, Robert. You can spend what little money you have left on lawyers and lawsuits and social media campaigns. But in the end, the result will be the same. The bank will foreclose, The company will be sold. The only question is whether you have any say in who buys it." Robert stared at her, his face purple with suppressed rage. His lawyers exchanged worried glances, clearly uncertain how to handle a negotiation that had gone so far off script. "Mr. Wellington," Davidson said carefully, "perhaps we should take a break. Discuss this privately before—" "No." Robert's voice was a growl, low and dangerous. "We are not taking a break. We are not discussing anything." He stood up from his chair, placed both hands flat on the table, leaned toward Elena with all the menace he could muster. "You think I am going to hand my company to you, after everything you have done, after you destroyed everything I built?" "I did not destroy anything. I left. The destruction came afterward." "Because you planned it. Because you knew exactly what would happen. You set this up, all of it, from the moment you signed those papers." Robert was shouting, now spittle flying from his lips, decades of suppressed conflict erupting in a hotel conference room. "You want to buy my company for $1, I would rather burn it to the ground. I would rather watch everything turn to ash than give you the satisfaction." "Robert." His female lawyer placed a hand on his arm. "This is not helpful. We need to—" He shook her off, his eyes never leaving Elena's face. "You are not my daughter. You never were. A real daughter would have stood by her family. A real daughter would have done her duty. You are just a parasite who fed off us for 38 years and then turned around and stabbed us in the back." Elena stood, slowly gathered her documents, placed them in her briefcase. Her hands were steady, her face composed, her voice when she spoke betraying nothing of what she felt. "The offer stands," she said. $1 plus assumption of debt. You have 48 hours to accept. After that, I withdraw the offer, and you can negotiate with the bank on your own." She walked to the door, Marcus beside her, leaving her father standing at the table surrounded by lawyers who could not help him and rage that could not save him. "Elena." She stopped, hand on the doorknob, but did not turn around. "You will regret this. I promise you. Whatever happens next, you will spend the rest of your life regretting what you did to this family." She opened the door, stepped through, let it close behind her without responding. Some threats did not deserve the dignity of acknowledgement. The hotel lobby was busy with weekend guests, families checking in for basketball tournaments, and business travelers finishing up Friday meetings. Elena walked through them without seeing them, her mind already racing ahead to what came next. Her father had rejected the offer, as she had known he would. His pride would not allow him to accept defeat, even when defeat was inevitable. He would fight until there was nothing left to fight with, and then he would fight some more. That was fine. She had prepared for this. She had been preparing for this since the night of her birthday, when she sat in her father's study and realized that the only way to win was to let him think he was winning. Marcus caught up with her at the revolving door. That went about as well as expected. He will not accept the offer. No. He would rather lose everything than admit you were right. Marcus held the door for her, followed her out into the cold March afternoon. "But Elena, you need to be prepared for what happens next. The bank is not going to wait forever. If your father cannot pay off the loan—" "I know. The personal guarantee. The house. Everything. I know." Elena stopped on the sidewalk, turned to face her lawyer. "Marcus, I have been preparing for this moment for 3 months. I know exactly what is going to happen, and I know exactly what I'm going to do about it. Trust me." "I do trust you. That is what worries me." She smiled, a small expression that did not reach her eyes. "Worry about my father? He is the one who needs it." They parted ways at the corner, Marcus heading toward the L station, Elena walking in the opposite direction with no particular destination in mind. She needed to think, needed to process, needed to be alone with the reality of what had just happened in that conference room. Her father had called her a parasite, had told her she was not his daughter, had promised she would regret everything. She had heard worse from him over the years, though rarely so explicitly. The insults he had delivered throughout her childhood were usually more subtle, wrapped in the language of disappointment and unfulfilled potential. "You are smart, Elena, but you will never be as charming as your sister. You work hard, Elena, but you do not have the presence to lead. You are useful, Elena, but do not forget where that usefulness comes from. Death by 1,000 cuts delivered over 38 years, until the wounds had become so familiar she barely noticed them anymore. until today when her father had finally said out loud what he had been saying with his actions her entire life. "You are not my daughter." She walked through the city, through neighborhoods she barely noticed, past people she did not see, until she found herself standing in front of a building she had not consciously chosen to visit. The offices of Hartwell Logistics, where she had been served with lawsuit papers, what felt like a lifetime ago. Where a job she had wanted had evaporated the moment her father decided to attack. She stood there for a long time, looking up at the glass and steel facade, thinking about roads not taken and futures that would never exist. Then she turned and walked away, heading home to wait for the news she knew was coming. It came the next morning. Sunday delivered via phone call from Marcus at 7:32 in the morning. "The bank issued an ultimatum," he said without preamble. 48 hours to cure the default, or they begin foreclosure proceedings. The full principal balance, $40 million plus accrued interest and fees. They want it by Tuesday at 5 o'clock. Elena sat up in bed, reached for the notepad she kept on her nightstand, began writing. "The company cannot pay. The company cannot pay 10% of that amount. They are completely out of cash. Robert has already sold everything liquid, the car, some artwork, a vacation property in Michigan. It is not enough. It is not even close to enough. And the personal guarantee, that is the other part of the ultimatum. If the company cannot pay, the bank will exercise its rights under the guarantee." Robert pledged his personal assets as collateral. "That includes—" Marcus paused. "That includes the house." The house in Lake Forest, the house where Elena had grown up, the house where she had been told she was nothing, where she had been asked to give away her inheritance, where her mother had come to record her for evidence. The house that represented everything the Wellington family had ever been and everything they had pretended to be. How long until the foreclosure is complete? If Robert does not pay by Tuesday, the bank will file the paperwork Wednesday morning. Given that he is unlikely to contest it, actual foreclosure could happen within 60 to 90 days. Maybe faster if the bank pushes. Elena set down her notepad, leaned back against her pillows, stared at the ceiling of her apartment. 60 to 90 days. After 35 years of ownership, after 3 generations of Wellingtons living within those walls, the house would be gone. Sold at auction, probably for a fraction of its value. The proceeds going to a bank that had been looking for an exit from this relationship for years. "Elena," Marcus's voice was careful. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Ask." "Is this what you wanted when you signed those papers, when you walked away, when you let everything fall apart? Was this the outcome you were hoping for?" Elena considered the question, considered the answer, considered what it said about her that she had to consider at all. "I wanted to be free," she said finally. "I wanted to stop carrying a weight that was never mine to carry. I wanted my father to understand just once what it felt like to face consequences for his own choices instead of having someone else clean up his messes. And the house? The house was collateral he chose to pledge. The guarantee was a document he chose to sign. I did not make those decisions. I was not even in the room when most of them happened." She paused. "But did I know? Did I see the shape of what was coming even when I signed those papers? Did you?" Elena closed her eyes, thought about the night of her birthday, about the documents spread across her father's desk, the pen in her hand, the certainty in her heart that she was setting something in motion that could not be stopped. "Yes," she said quietly. "I knew. Maybe not the specifics, but the general shape of it. I knew that a company built on my labor could not survive without it. I knew that my father's arrogance would prevent him from asking for help until it was too late. I knew that the banks and the creditors and the market itself would do what I could not bring myself to do directly. And you made peace with that." "I made peace with the truth, Marcus. The truth is that Wellington Logistics was already dying when I left. My father had been coasting on grandmother's legacy for decades, making decisions based on ego instead of analysis, treating employees like disposable assets, ignoring every warning sign because acknowledging them would have required admitting he was not the genius he believed himself to be." Elena opened her eyes, stared at the ceiling. "I was the only thing keeping it alive, and staying was killing me." Marcus was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was gentle. "What do you want to do now?" Now. Elena sat up, swung her legs over the side of the bed, felt the cold floor against her bare feet. Now we wait. 48 hours for the ultimatum to expire. Then we see what rises from the ashes. She ended the call, set down her phone, and went to make herself a cup of coffee. The countdown had begun. The call came on Tuesday morning, 18 hours before the bank's deadline expired, from a number Elena did not recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail, assuming it was another reporter or another process server or another of the countless strangers who had found her contact information in the weeks since her father's social media campaign had made her a minor celebrity in Chicago business circles. Something made her answer. Elena Wellington. The voice was familiar, but she could not immediately place it. Female mid-20s, slightly breathless, with the kind of urgency that came from genuine distress rather than manufactured drama. This is Elena. It's Maria Santos. I used to work in accounting. You helped me get the job at Hartwell after... The voice caught, steadied itself. Listen, something happened. Something bad. I thought you should know before you hear it somewhere else. Elena sat down on her couch, tucked her feet beneath her, prepared herself for whatever was coming. Tell me. Tiffany is gone. She cleaned out the company safe last night and took a flight to Paris. First-class one-way ticket. Nobody knew until this morning when the morning shift supervisor tried to access petty cash and found the safe empty. Elena processed this information, turned it over in her mind. The company safe typically held between $30,000 and $50,000 in cash emergency funds for situations that required immediate payment. Not a fortune by Wellington standards, but enough to finance several months of comfortable living in Europe if one was careful, or several weeks of extravagant living if one was Tiffany. How much did she take? $43,000 according to the records. But Elena, that's not the worst part. Maria's voice dropped as if she were afraid of being overheard. Your father, Mr. Wellington. He collapsed this morning. In the office. They called an ambulance. He's at Northwestern Memorial right now. The words hung in the air, heavy with implications Elena was not yet ready to examine. Collapsed? They think it was a stroke. A minor one, the paramedics said, but still. He's in the ICU. Your mother is there. I thought... Maria paused, seemed to be struggling with what to say next. I thought you should know. In case you wanted to. I don't know. I just thought you should know. Thank you, Maria. I appreciate you calling. Are you going to go to the hospital? Elena looked out her window at the city spread below, the same view she had been contemplating for months now, watching the slow-motion collapse of everything her father had built. Her father was in the hospital. Her father had suffered a stroke. Her father might be dying for all she knew, surrounded by machines and strangers, while his golden child fled to another continent with stolen money. I don't know, she said honestly. I need to think. She ended the call, set down her phone, and sat in the silence of her apartment for a long time. The updates continued to arrive throughout the day, a steady stream of information from the network of former colleagues who had become her eyes and ears inside a company she no longer officially belonged to. 10:30 in the morning. The police were called to investigate the theft from the safe. Security footage showed Tiffany entering the building at 11:47 the previous night, accessing the safe with a combination she had apparently memorized or stolen, and leaving with a leather duffel bag that she had not arrived with. The footage had been forwarded to the Paris authorities, though no one expected it to result in any meaningful action. Tiffany was a United States citizen in a foreign country accused of taking money from a company she partially owned. The legal complexities would take months to untangle if they were ever untangled at all. 12:15 in the afternoon. Wellington Logistics officially ceased operations. With no cash reserves, no access to credit, no functioning leadership, and now no one willing to authorize even basic expenditures, the company had no choice but to stop. Drivers were told to return their trucks to the nearest depot and go home. Warehouse workers were sent home without pay. The phone lines were disconnected because no one had authorized the monthly payment. The website went dark an hour later, replaced by a generic hosting error that would become a permanent memorial to a company that had once employed 300 people and moved goods across half the continent. 2:45 in the afternoon. Jennifer forwarded a screenshot from a travel blog Tiffany had apparently started that morning, posted from a cafe in the Marais district of Paris. The photo showed a croissant and a café au lait artfully arranged on a marble table with a caption that read, "New beginnings. Sometimes you have to leave everything behind to find yourself." The post had 47 likes and 12 comments, mostly from friends who apparently had no idea that the new beginning in question had been funded by theft and enabled by abandonment. 4:30 in the afternoon. Marcus called with news from the hospital. Robert Wellington had suffered what doctors were calling a transient ischemic attack, a mini-stroke caused by a temporary disruption of blood flow to the brain. He was stable, conscious, but confused and agitated. He had been asking for Tiffany. No one had told him yet that Tiffany was gone. "The bank deadline is in 12 hours, Marcus said. "If he can't sign documents, if he's incapacitated, then his wife becomes the decision-maker, or his designated power of attorney. Which is," Elena almost laughed, "me. He appointed me as his healthcare proxy and financial power of attorney 15 years ago when he had a cancer scare. Said he trusted me to make the hard decisions if it came to that." She paused, let the irony settle. He never revoked it, probably forgot it existed like he forgot about the personal guarantee. Marcus was silent for a long moment. "Elena, do you understand what this means? It means that if my father is incapacitated, I have the legal authority to make decisions on his behalf, including decisions about the company." She stood, walked to her window, watched the late afternoon light paint the city in shades of gold and shadow. "Including decisions about whether to accept my own offer." That would be unprecedented. Ethically questionable at minimum, possibly illegal. "Only if I'm acting against his interests. If I'm acting to preserve what's left of his assets, to minimize his losses, to negotiate the best possible outcome with his creditors." She let the sentence hang. "That's exactly what a fiduciary is supposed to do." "You would be negotiating with yourself." "I would be negotiating with the bank, with the creditors, with everyone who has a claim against Wellington Logistics and Robert Wellington personally." Elena turned from the window. "The offer I made at the Marriott is still the best option. $1 for the equity assumption of all debt. It's the only way to avoid complete liquidation. And you just happen to be the buyer. I'm the only buyer. No one else is going to touch this mess with a 10-foot pole. The company is worthless without someone who knows how to run it. And I'm the only person alive who knows every system, every contract, every relationship that made it work." She paused. "I'm not stealing anything, Marcus. I'm buying a disaster at the only price anyone would pay for it. And your father. My father made his choices. He chose to force me out. He chose to put Tiffany in charge. He chose to fight me in court instead of accepting help when it was offered." Elena's voice hardened. "He chose to pledge his house as collateral for a loan he couldn't repay. None of those were my decisions. All of them were his. What are you going to do?" Elena looked at the clock on her wall. 7 hours until the bank deadline. 7 hours until $40 million came due and the foreclosure proceedings began. 7 hours until her father lost everything because he had refused to listen to the only person who could have saved him. "I'm going to the hospital," she said. "I think it's time my father and I had a conversation." Northwestern Memorial Hospital occupied a complex of buildings along the lakefront, a maze of glass and steel that had grown over decades to become one of the largest medical centers in the Midwest. Elena arrived at 6:30 in the evening, parked in the visitor garage, and walked through the automatic doors into a lobby that smelled of antiseptic and coffee and the particular anxiety that permeated all hospitals everywhere. She had not been here since her grandmother died 4 years ago in a private room on the oncology floor, where the staff spoke in hushed voices and the walls were painted in colors meant to soothe. That visit had ended with a death and an inheritance and the beginning of everything that had led to this moment. This visit would end differently, though she was not yet certain how. The ICU was on the 4th floor, accessible only through a set of locked doors that required a visitor badge and a check-in with the nursing station. Elena provided her name, showed her identification, explained her relationship to the patient. The nurse who processed her paperwork was a young woman with tired eyes who did not seem to recognize the Wellington name or care about the drama that surrounded it. "He's in room 412. Visiting hours end at 8. Please keep your visit brief. He's still very weak. Elena walked down the corridor past rooms where other patients lay connected to machines and monitors, past families gathered in anxious clusters, past doctors and nurses, moving with the particular efficiency of people who spent their days surrounded by crisis. She counted the room numbers as she passed 408, 410, 412. The door was slightly ajar. Through the gap, she could see the foot of a hospital bed, the shape of a figure beneath thin blankets, the green glow of a heart monitor displaying numbers she could not read from this angle. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. Robert Wellington looked like a stranger. The man she had known her entire life, the man who had filled every room he entered with the force of his personality, lay small and diminished in the hospital bed. His silver hair was matted and unwashed. His face was slack on one side, the muscles not quite responding the way they should. His eyes, when they opened at the sound of her entrance, were clouded with confusion and something that might have been fear. Margaret sat in a chair beside the bed, her hands twisted together in her lap, her face swollen from crying. She looked up when Elena entered, and for a moment something like hope flickered across her features before being replaced by wariness. "Elena, you came." "I came. Your father has been asking for you, in his lucid moments." Margaret took a step toward her daughter, then stopped as if uncertain whether her approach would be welcome. "The doctors say the stroke was minor. He should recover most of his function, but he's confused. He keeps asking for Tiffany." "Tiffany is in Paris." "I know, I saw the Instagram post." Margaret's voice cracked. How could she? How could she just leave him like this?" Elena did not answer. She walked past her mother to the side of the bed, looked down at the man who had raised her, who had shaped her, who had spent 38 years making her feel invisible and inadequate and never quite good enough. He looked old. He looked tired. He looked like what he was, a man who had finally run out of the privilege and luck that had sustained him for so long. "Robert." His eyes focused on her slowly, like a camera finding its subject through fog. His mouth moved, trying to form words, but only sounds came out at first, garbled and indistinct. Then, with visible effort, he managed a single word. "Elena." "Yes." "You came." "I came." She pulled the visitor chair closer to the bed, sat down, folded her hands in her lap. "We need to talk." "Tiffany." His voice was slurred, the words coming slowly. "Where is Tiffany?" "Gone. She took money from the company and left the country." Robert's eyes opened again. Something moved across his face that might have been grief or might have been simply exhaustion. "She left last night, while you were working. She emptied the company safe and caught a flight to Paris." Elena kept her voice level, clinical. "She's posting pictures of croissants on Instagram. She seems to be enjoying herself." Margaret made a sound behind her, something between a sob and a gasp. Robert's heart monitor beeped slightly faster, the numbers climbing in response to emotional distress. I don't understand. She wouldn't. She loves me." "She loved what you gave her. The money, the title, the lifestyle. When those things disappeared, so did she." Elena leaned forward slightly. "That's not love, Robert. That's transaction." No, you're wrong. Tiffany is a good girl. She needed someone to take care of her, someone to clean up her messes, pay her bills, protect her from consequences. You were that person. Now you can't be." Elena paused, let the words sink in. "I could have been that person too if you had let me, but you wanted me to give her everything I had, everything grandmother left me so that she could impress some rich family and marry some rich man. You chose her over me, and this is where that choice led." Robert's eyes were wet now, tears leaking from the corners running down the slack side of his face. His hand moved on the blanket, reaching for something, finding nothing. "I made mistakes. Yes. I should have listened, should have seen what you were doing, for the company, for us. Yes. Elena." His hand found hers, somehow cold and trembling, gripping with whatever strength he had left. "Help me. Please, I don't know what to do." She looked at his hand on hers, at the fingers that had once signed documents demanding her inheritance, at the wedding ring that had bound him to a woman who would record her own daughter for evidence, at the age spots and wrinkles and visible veins that marked the passage of time on skin that had never known real work. "I know what to do," she said, "but you're not going to like it." "Anything. I'll do anything." Elena reached into her bag, pulled out a folder, set it on the bed beside him. "This is a sale agreement. It transfers ownership of Wellington Logistics to me, along with all assets and liabilities. The purchase price is $1. Robert stared at the folder as if it were a snake that might bite him. "You also sign a release of all claims against me. The lawsuit, the accusations, everything. Dropped. In exchange, I assume responsibility for the bank debt and the other creditors. I negotiate on your behalf to minimize your personal exposure. The house was pledged as collateral. You signed a personal guarantee 7 years ago. If the company can't pay, the bank can foreclose." Elena opened the folder, spread the documents across the bed where he could see them. "If you sign these papers, I can negotiate with the bank. Try to restructure the debt, extend the timeline, find a way to save what's left. Without my involvement, they foreclose tomorrow and you lose everything." "You would save the house?" "I would try. I can't promise anything. The bank has the right to foreclose regardless of what I do. But I have relationships there. I have credibility. I might be able to convince them that a restructured loan is better than a fire sale liquidation." She paused. "But I need the company to do it. I need the authority to negotiate on behalf of Wellington Logistics. That means you have to sell it to me. For $1. For $1 and the assumption of $40 million in debt." Elena met his eyes. "You're not giving me anything, Robert. You're giving me a disaster. I'm the only person willing to take it." The room was silent except for the beeping of monitors and Margaret's quiet weeping in the corner. Robert stared at the documents, at his daughter, at the ceiling, as if looking for some escape from the reality that had finally caught up with him. "Your grandmother," he said finally. "She always said, you were the strong one." "She was right. I should have listened to her. Should have seen." His voice trailed off, lost in the fog of exhaustion and medication and the weight of decades of mistakes. "You taught me something, Robert." Elena picked up a pen from the bedside table, placed it in his trembling hand. "You taught me that business is war, that the strong survive and the weak are eliminated, that sentiment has no place in the boardroom." She guided his hand to the first signature line. "I learned well. This is my final lesson." His hand shook as he signed, The signature was barely legible, a trembling scrawl that bore little resemblance to the bold strokes that had once commanded respect and fear. But it was recognizable. It was legal. It was enough. She turned to the next page, guided him through the next signature and the next. Release of claims, transfer of authority, assumption of debt. One by one, the documents that would reshape both their lives received their marks. When it was done, Elena gathered the papers, returned them to the folder, tucked the folder back into her bag. Robert lay against his pillows, exhausted, his eyes half closed, his breathing shallow and uneven. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now I go to work." Elena stood, pushed the chair back to its original position. "The bank deadline is in 5 hours. I have calls to make." "Elena." His voice stopped her at the door. Will you come back?" She turned, looked at the man in the hospital bed, the man who had been her father and her enemy, and now was neither. He looked small. He looked lost. He looked like someone who had finally realized that the empire he thought he ruled had been made of sand all along. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I have a company to save." She walked out of the room, past the nursing station, through the locked doors, into the elevator that would carry her down to the lobby and out into the night. Behind her, in a room on the 4th floor, Robert Wellington lay in the wreckage of everything he had built alone, except for a wife who could not help him and the ghost of a daughter who would not. The doors closed. The elevator descended. And Elena Wellington, for the first time in her life, felt the weight of real power settling onto her shoulders. It was heavier than she had expected. It was lighter than she had feared. It felt like exactly what she had been waiting for. The Wellington Logistics building stood dark against the Wednesday morning sky. Elena parked in the visitor lot, walked to the service entrance, and used a key she had never bothered to remove from her ring. The corridor smelled of dust and abandonment. She navigated by memory to the electrical room, found the main breaker, and pushed it from off to on. The building shuddered awake. Lights flickered, stabilized. The HVAC system groaned to life. The hum of electricity filled the space like a heartbeat resuming after cardiac arrest. Elena took the elevator to the 32nd floor and stepped into chaos frozen in time. Desks covered with abandoned papers, cold coffee cups, dead plants. The particular stillness of a place that had stopped mid-breath and never started again. She ended her tour in the corner office, the one Tiffany had renovated at such extraordinary expense. Meditation cushions, a juice bar, $200,000 of waste surrounding a glass desk covered with fashion magazines and cosmetic samples. Elena swept it all into the trash with one motion. Then she sat down and began making calls. Jennifer Huang answered on the second ring. "I need you," Elena said. "I just acquired the company. I need someone I trust to help me rebuild." "You bought Wellington Logistics for $1.40 million in debt. Can you come?" "I'll be there in an hour." Carlos Martinez took longer to convince. He had a family, a mortgage, a secure position at a competitor. But he remembered the coffee in the snow, the job she had found him after the purge, the years of being treated like a person instead of a resource. "When do you need me?" "Today." "Give me 2 hours. Maria Santos, David Kim, Patricia Okonkwo." One by one, Elena reassembled the team that had once made Wellington Logistics function, the people who had scattered when her father's regime collapsed, but who still remembered what competent leadership looked like. By noon, they were gathered in the conference room, 5 people willing to bet their careers on her ability to resurrect something everyone else had buried. "Here's the situation," Elena said. $40 million in bank debt, $6 million in other obligations, 0 cash, 0 credit, 40 trucks sitting idle with no drivers and no customers. She let the numbers sink in. "Here's what we're going to do." She assigned tasks with the precision of a general deploying troops. Financial audit, system restoration, client outreach, driver recruitment. Each person knew exactly what was expected and exactly why it mattered. "What about the bank?" Jennifer asked. "They should be filing foreclosure today." "I have a meeting at First Chicago in 3 hours. I've been preparing for this moment for 3 months." The bank's offices occupied a tower on LaSalle Street. Elena arrived carrying a portfolio that contained everything she had built during her weeks of exile. Business plans, financial projections, asset analyses, a restructuring proposal that would convert debt to equity in exchange for extended terms and restored credit. 3 bankers waited in the conference room: Michael Chen, the relationship manager, Sarah Goldman, the credit officer, James Morrison, a senior vice president whose presence signaled how seriously they were taking this meeting. Elena presented her case with the same calm competence she had demonstrated 1,000 times over 18 years. She walked them through the numbers. She explained how the company had collapsed not because it was broken, but because the only person who knew how to run it had been forced out. She showed them projections that demonstrated recovery was possible under proper management. "I've seen a lot of turnaround situations," James Morrison said when she finished. "Most fail. The ones that succeed have leadership. Someone who knows the business, commands respect, makes hard decisions." He studied her across the table. "Robert Wellington thought he was running that company. He wasn't. You were. I'm recommending we accept your proposal," he continued. "Conditionally. Quarterly reviews, performance guarantees, acceleration rights. But I think you can do this." Elena walked out of the bank as the sun set over Lake Michigan. The company was hers. The means to rebuild it was secured. Now the real work began. The next 6 weeks blurred into a marathon of 18-hour days and 4-hour sleeps. Elena fired everyone. Tiffany had hired the social media consultants and wellness coordinators who contributed nothing but expense. She terminated useless contracts. She sold the juice bar equipment for $12,000. The meditation cushions for $3,000 recovered, $18,000 from the Mercedes dealership for the deposit on a car now sitting in Paris. Every dollar went to payroll first, then vendors, then the bank. By late April, 30 trucks were running again. By mid-May, the routing system was fully operational with efficiency improvements David had designed. By late May, the quarterly review showed results exceeding projections. Revenue up, costs down. The debt service coverage ratio back above covenant threshold. The bankers left impressed. The employees left energized. Elena left exhausted but satisfied. She was wrong to feel safe. The confrontation came on a Friday afternoon in early June. Elena was reviewing contracts when she heard commotion in the lobby. Raised voices, rapid heels, Jennifer's strained protests about appointments and proper channels. Then the door burst open. Tiffany looked like she had aged 5 years in 3 months. Thinner, harder, with manic energy that suggested stimulants or desperation or both. Her designer dress was wrinkled from a long flight. Her makeup was smeared. Her eyes were wild. "You think you can just take everything, steal this company while I'm gone?" Elena set down her pen. "Hello, Tiffany. How was Paris? Don't you dare sit there like you own the place." "I do own the place. I bought it from Dad while he was in the hospital. $1. Check the corporate filings. He would never sell to you." "He did, because the alternative was losing everything." Elena walked around the desk. "You abandoned him, stole money and ran to Europe while he was having a stroke. When he needed you most, you were posting pictures of croissants." "I was going to come back. You came back because you ran out of money. 43,000 doesn't last long in Paris at 5-star hotels." Elena took a step closer. "I've seen your credit card statements. You burned through everything in 8 weeks." "That money was mine. I'm a shareholder." "You were a shareholder. When Dad sold to me, your shares became worthless. You're not entitled to anything." Tiffany's face crumpled. "This is still Daddy's company. You're just the help. You've always been the help. That's over now. This company belongs to me. I earned it. I saved it." Elena walked back to her desk, picked up a folder. "You also have another problem. Documentation of every dollar you took. Personal expenses. The safe you emptied. $392,000. That's theft, Tiffany. Criminal. You can't prosecute family." "I'm not family anymore. Dad made that clear." Elena set down the folder. "I haven't filed charges yet, but if you challenge my ownership or interfere with my management, these documents go to the district attorney." Tiffany went pale. "What do you want?" "Leave. Find your own life. Stop expecting other people to take care of you." Elena returned to her contracts. "Disappear. Let me work. Maybe someday become someone worth knowing." Tiffany stood frozen, then turned toward the door. At the threshold, she stopped. "I hate you. I've always hated you." "I know." Elena did not look up. "The difference is I don't feel anything about you anymore. You're just irrelevant." Tiffany made a sound that might have been a sob. Then she was gone. Elena sat alone in the silence that followed. The ghosts of her old life had been exorcised. Her father diminished. Her mother exposed. Her sister stripped of power and illusions. All that remained was the work. The company. The future she was building from ruins. She picked up the phone. "Jennifer, cancel my afternoon, and thank you for everything." "Always, boss." Elena turned to face the window, looking out at the city that had been her home for 38 years. The city where she had been invisible, undervalued, and had finally found strength to walk away. The city that belonged to her now. One more confrontation remained. One more ghost to lay to rest. But that could wait until tomorrow. The conference room on the 32nd floor had been designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline, the lake glittering in the distance like hammered silver under the June sun. The table was glass and chrome, reflecting light in ways that made everyone seated around it feel exposed. The chairs were leather and ergonomic, comfortable enough for long negotiations, but not comfortable enough to let anyone forget this was a place where serious things happened. Elena had chosen this room deliberately. Not the corner office that had once belonged to her father with its associations of old power and failed leadership. Not the smaller meeting rooms where day-to-day business was conducted. This room, with its transparent walls and its unobstructed views, was a stage, and the final act of a very long play was about to begin. She arrived first at 9:45, 15 minutes before the scheduled meeting. Marcus came with her carrying a briefcase that contained every document they might need and several they probably would not. They took seats on one side of the glass table, arranged their papers, and waited. At 9:53, the elevator doors opened, and Robert Wellington emerged. He was in a wheelchair, now pushed by a home health aide whose name Elena did not know. The stroke had taken more from him than anyone had initially realized. His left side remained weak, the muscles refusing to fully cooperate with the commands his brain sent them. His speech had improved, but was still slower than before, each word requiring effort that had once been automatic. His face, which had commanded boardrooms for 35 years, now sagged slightly on one side, a permanent reminder of the night his body had finally rebelled against the stress he had subjected it to. Behind him came Tiffany. She had cleaned herself up since their confrontation a week ago. The designer dress had been replaced by a professional suit, probably borrowed or bought on credit, she no longer had access to. Her hair was styled, her makeup careful, her posture rigid, with the particular tension of someone who knew they were walking into a battle they could not win, but refused to surrender without a fight. They took their seats across from Elena and Marcus. The aide positioned Robert's wheelchair at the head of the table, a small dignity that Elena allowed because it cost her nothing and meant everything to the man who had lost so much. Silence filled the room. The city hummed beyond the windows, oblivious to the drama unfolding 32 floors above its streets. "Thank you for coming," Elena said finally. Her voice was calm, professional, the voice she had used in 1,000 negotiations over 18 years. "I thought it was time we resolved the outstanding issues between us." "Outstanding issues." Tiffany's voice was sharp, brittle. "You mean the fact that you stole our company?" "I purchased a company that was hours away from foreclosure using funds I had access to through a legal transaction that was properly documented and filed." Elena opened the folder in front of her, removed the first document. "This is the sale agreement, signed by Robert James Wellington on March 15th of this year, witnessed by hospital staff, notarized by a licensed notary public. The purchase price was $1 plus assumption of all outstanding debt." She slid the document across the table. Tiffany grabbed it, scanned, it looked up with fury in her eyes. "He was in the hospital. He had just had a stroke. He wasn't competent to sign anything. His treating physician provided a written statement confirming that Mr. Wellington was alert-oriented and capable of understanding the documents presented to him." Elena removed another paper from the folder. "Here is that statement, dated the same day, signed by Dr. Michael Reeves, attending physician at Northwestern Memorial. This is fraud. This is elder abuse. I'll get lawyers, You'll do what exactly?" Elena's voice remained steady, almost gentle. "Contest a sale that saved your father from complete financial ruin? Challenge a transaction that prevented the bank from foreclosing on his home?" She paused. "The home that has since been transferred to the bank. Your father signed a deed in lieu of foreclosure 3 weeks ago. It was the only way to clear the remaining debt without years of litigation." Robert made a sound something between a cough and a sob. His eyes, which had been fixed on the table, lifted briefly to meet Elena's, then dropped again. The house in Lake Forest was gone. 3 generations of Wellington history signed away with a stroke of a pen to avoid the humiliation of a public foreclosure battle. The bank had already sold it to a developer. The bulldozers would arrive next month. "The house," Tiffany's voice faltered. "Daddy, you signed away the house." Robert's silence was answer enough. "It was that or face years in court while the bank picked apart everything he owned," Elena said flatly. "The deed in lieu was the cleaner option, the faster death." Robert did not answer. His left hand trembled on the armrest of his wheelchair, the only sign of the emotions moving through him. "The house was pledged as collateral for the original loan," Elena explained. "A personal guarantee your father signed 7 years ago and apparently forgot about. When the company defaulted, the bank exercised its rights. The sale closed last week. The proceeds covered approximately 60% of the remaining debt. I've negotiated a payment plan for the rest." "You negotiated?" Tiffany shook her head, her face cycling through expressions of disbelief and rage. "You have no right. No right to make decisions about our family's assets. I'm a shareholder. I own 49% of this company." "You owned 49% of a company that no longer exists." Elena removed another document from her folder. Wellington Logistics Incorporated was dissolved as part of the restructuring. The assets were transferred to a new entity wholly owned by me. Your shares in the old company have no value because the old company has no assets. That's not possible. You can't just. I can. I did. With the full cooperation of the bank, the creditors, and the court. Elena set down the document. But that's not why we're here today. We're here because of this. She opened a different folder, one that had been sitting untouched at her elbow. Inside was a USB drive and a stack of printed photographs. This is security footage from the night of March 14th, the night before your father's stroke. Elena slid the first photograph across the table. This shows you entering the Wellington Logistics Building at 11:47 p.m. Alone. Another photograph. This shows you accessing the executive floor using a keycard that was registered to your father. Another. This shows you entering the finance office where the company safe is located. Another. This shows you kneeling in front of the safe, entering the combination. Another. This shows you removing stacks of cash and placing them in a leather duffel bag. Another. This shows you leaving the building at 12:23 a.m. carrying the duffel bag that you did not have when you arrived. Tiffany's face had gone white. Her hands resting on the glass table were trembling. The safe contained $43,000 in cash, Elena continued. Emergency operating funds. All of it was gone when the morning shift supervisor checked the following day. She paused. That same morning, you boarded a first-class flight to Paris, one-way ticket, paid in cash. I had authorization. Daddy knew I was taking. Daddy was in the ICU having a stroke while you were in Charles de Gaulle Airport buying croissants. Elena's voice hardened for the first time. Don't lie to me, Tiffany. Not now. Not after everything. Silence. Tiffany's eyes darted to her father, seeking support, seeking rescue, seeking the protection that had always been there whenever she faced consequences. Robert did not look at her. He sat in his wheelchair, his good hand gripping the armrest, his face turned toward the windows and the city beyond. He had heard the evidence. He had seen the photographs. And for the first time in his life, he had nothing to offer his golden child except his silence. Daddy? Tiffany's voice cracked. Daddy, say something. Tell her she's wrong. Tell her. He can't tell me I'm wrong because I'm not wrong. Elena gathered the photographs, returned them to the folder. You stole from the company, Tiffany, while your father was having a medical emergency, while the business he spent his life building was collapsing. You took what you could carry and you ran. I was scared. I didn't know what else to do. Everything was falling apart and I panicked. You panicked all the way to the Louis Vuitton store on the Champs-Élysées. You panicked through 3 weeks at the Hotel Plaza Athénée. You panicked at every Michelin-starred restaurant in Paris. Elena's voice was flat, reciting facts. I have your credit card statements, Tiffany. I know exactly how you spent your panic. Tiffany's composure finally broke. Tears spilled down her cheeks, ruining the careful makeup, leaving tracks of mascara like dark wounds on her pale skin. What do you want from me? I don't have anything left. The money's gone. I can't pay it back. I don't want your money. I don't want anything from you except your absence. Elena closed both folders, set them aside. You have 2 choices. Option 1, you walk out of this building, you never come back, and you never contact me or anyone associated with this company again. You find your own life somewhere else, and you leave me to run my business in peace. And option 2. Option 2, I call the police. I give them the security footage. I file charges for theft, embezzlement, and whatever else the district attorney thinks will stick. Elena met her sister's eyes. $43,000. That's grand theft. That's a felony. That's prison time, Tiffany. Real prison, not the white-collar facilities where rich people serve their sentences. You won't do well there. The tears were flowing freely now. Tiffany's face contorted with fear and desperation. She turned to Roberts again, her voice rising to something approaching a wail. Daddy, please. You have to help me. You have to do something. She can't do this. He can't help you. Elena's voice cut through the hysteria. He has nothing left to help you with. No money, no influence, no power. Everything he had, he lost. Some of it to bad decisions, some of it to the bank, some of it to me. She paused. And some of it to you, Tiffany. To the decades he spent giving you everything you wanted while teaching you nothing about how to earn it. Robert finally moved. Slowly, painfully, he turned his wheelchair away from the table, away from his daughters, until he was facing the windows with his back to both of them. His shoulders shook once, twice, then went still. The silence that followed was the heaviest Elena had ever experienced. She watched her sister process the reality of her situation, watched the calculations happening behind those tear-filled eyes as Tiffany realized that there was no one coming to save her, no safety net waiting to catch her, no escape from the consequences she had spent her entire life avoiding. "Fine," the word came out as a whisper. "I'll leave. I'll go. And you won't come back. And I won't come back. And you won't contact me or anyone at this company or any of our clients or vendors or partners. I won't." "Good." Elena stood, walked to the door, opened it. "Jennifer will escort you out. I suggest you use the time between now and the lobby to compose yourself. The employees don't need to see you crying." Tiffany rose on unsteady legs, gathered her purse, and walked toward the door. At the threshold she stopped, turned back to look at the man in the wheelchair who still had not turned around. "This is your fault." Her voice was low, venomous. "All of it. You gave everything to her, to the boring one, the invisible one, and now look at us. You're a useless old man in a wheelchair and I have nothing. Nothing." She laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. "Mother was right. She always said you would ruin us someday. I just never thought it would be like this." She walked out without waiting for a response. Jennifer, who had been standing discreetly in the hallway, fell into step beside her, guiding her toward the elevator with professional efficiency. The door closed. Elena stood alone with her father and Marcus, the glass walls of the conference room suddenly feeling less like transparency and more like a cage. "Robert." He did not turn around. "Robert, I need you to look at me." Slowly, the wheelchair rotated. Her father's face was wet, tears tracking down the slack side, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. He looked like what he was, a man who had lost everything and was only now beginning to understand how much of it he had lost himself. "She's gone," he said. His voice was thick, slurred by emotion as much as by the stroke's lingering effects. "My daughter, my Tiffany. Gone. She was never really yours?" Elena returned to her seat, folded her hands on the table. "She was your fantasy, the perfect child who would reflect your glory and continue your legacy. But she was never real. The real Tiffany was the woman who stole from you while you were having a stroke. The real Tiffany was the woman who just called you a useless old man. And you." Robert's eyes met hers, searching for something, perhaps mercy, perhaps understanding, perhaps just acknowledgement. "Were you ever really mine? I was the daughter who wanted to be yours, the one who worked and studied and sacrificed, hoping that someday you would see me the way you saw her." Elena paused. "But you never did. And eventually I stopped hoping. I was wrong." The words came slowly, painfully, as if each one cost him something. "I was wrong about everything. About Tiffany. About you. About what mattered." "Yes, you were. Can you—" He stopped, swallowed, tried again. "Can you ever forgive me?" Elena considered the question. Considered the man asking it, diminished and broken, sitting in a wheelchair in a building that had once been his kingdom. Considered all the years of invisibility and erasure, all the birthday cakes in the wrong flavor, all the moments when he could have chosen to see her and chose instead to look away. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I don't hate you anymore. I'm not sure I ever really hated you, but forgiveness—" She shook her head. "That's a process, not a moment. Maybe someday. Maybe never. I can't promise something I don't know how to give." Robert nodded slowly, accepting the answer, perhaps understanding for the first time that he had no right to expect more. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now you leave. The aide will take you back to the care facility. You'll continue your rehabilitation. In a few months, maybe a year, you'll be well enough to live independently again." Elena stood, gathered her folders. "I've arranged for a trust to cover your medical expenses and basic living costs. It's not luxury, but it's comfortable. More than comfortable." "You're taking care of me." "I'm fulfilling the obligations of a daughter to her father. Nothing more, nothing less." She walked to the door, paused with her hand on the frame. "Goodbye, Robert. I hope your recovery goes well." She left him there alone in the glass conference room, surrounded by windows that looked out on a city that no longer belonged to him. Marcus followed her out, closing the door softly behind them. They walked in silence to Elena's office, the corner space that had once been Robert's stripped now of all the renovations Tiffany had added, returned to something functional and clean. Elena sat behind her desk, let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for months. "It's done," Marcus said. "Almost." Elena opened her laptop, pulled up an email she had drafted the night before. "There's one more thing." She typed a few words, attached a file, and pressed send. "What was that?" "Instructions to the sign company. They're coming tomorrow to change the name on the building." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What's the new name?" Elena smiled, the first genuine smile she had allowed herself in weeks. "Castillo Logistics, my grandmother's maiden name, before she married into the Wellington family, before any of this started." "Castillo," Marcus tested the word. "I like it." "So do I." Elena closed her laptop, walked to the window. She would have liked it too. She always hated the Wellington name, said it sounded pretentious, said she only took it because that's what women did in her generation. She paused. "She told me once near the end that her only regret was not keeping her own name, not building her company under her own identity instead of her husband's. Now you're doing it for her. Now I'm doing it for both of us." The city spread out below them, glass and steel and stone, millions of people going about their lives with no idea that something had shifted in the power structure high above their heads. The Wellington name, which had meant something in Chicago business circles for 60 years, would fade from memory. In its place, something new would grow. Something that belonged to Elena alone. Marcus left an hour later, promising to file the final paperwork to close out the lawsuits that were no longer necessary to tie up the loose ends that always accumulated at the end of complicated legal matters. Elena stayed in her office, working through the afternoon, signing documents and reviewing contracts and doing the 1,000 small tasks that kept a company running. At 6 o'clock, she finally allowed herself to stop. She shut down her computer, gathered her things, and walked through the floor that was now entirely hers. Past the cubicles where her employees worked, past the conference rooms where meetings happened, past the kitchen where someone had left a pot of coffee warming, filling the air with a smell that reminded her of all the early mornings she had spent here, invisible and essential. The elevator was waiting when she pressed the button. She stepped inside, pressed the button for the lobby, and watched the doors close. The car was glass on 3 sides, a design choice that had always made her slightly uncomfortable, the sensation of hanging suspended over the city with nothing but transparency between her and the long fall down. She had avoided these elevators for years, preferring the solid walls of the service lifts, telling herself it was about efficiency rather than fear. Now she stood in the center of the glass box and felt nothing but calm. The city rose around her as the elevator descended buildings, reaching toward a sky that was beginning to shade toward evening gold. She could see the lake in the distance, the boats cutting white trails across blue water. She could see the streets below, the cars and buses and pedestrians moving in patterns that seemed chaotic from above, but made perfect sense at ground level. She reached into her bag and pulled out the coffee she had bought earlier, a simple cup from the shop on the corner. Nothing fancy. Just good coffee made by people who cared about their craft. She took a sip, let the warmth spread through her, and watched the floors tick by on the digital display. 30, 25, 20. She thought about the woman she had been 3 months ago, standing in a different elevator in this same building, heart-racing hands full of reports and projections and all the documentation of her invisible labor. That woman had been afraid. Afraid of her father's judgment. Afraid of her own inadequacy. Afraid that if she stopped working for even a moment, she would have to face the emptiness that waited underneath all the busyness. That woman was gone now, not dead exactly, but transformed, shed like a skin that no longer fit, left behind in the hospital room where she had watched her father sign away his empire. 15. 10. 5. The elevator slowed, settled, came to rest. The doors opened onto the lobby, marble floors and evening light, and the security guard at the desk, who nodded respectfully as she passed. "Good night, Miss Castillo." The name still sounded strange, still felt like a costume she was trying on, testing for fit. But it was hers. Her grandmother's name. Her own name now. A name that belonged to no one else, that carried no weight of expectation or disappointment, that was entirely and completely her own. Good night, Marcus. She walked through the lobby, through the revolving doors, out onto the sidewalk where the evening crowds were beginning to gather. People heading home from work, people heading out for dinner, people living their lives, making their choices, carrying their own invisible burdens that no one else could see. Elena stood on the corner and drank her coffee and watched the city move around her. She thought about the night of her birthday 5 months ago, when she had stood in a different spot and looked up at this same building and wondered if she would ever feel free. She had not known then what freedom would cost, had not understood that liberation required destruction, that building something new meant letting something old burn. Now she knew. The cup was empty. She tossed it in a recycling bin, adjusted her bag on her shoulder, and began walking toward the train that would carry her home. The same Lincoln Park apartment where she had spent weeks in exile watching her family collapse from a distance. The same small rooms, the same window overlooking the city. But everything felt different now. The space that had once been a refuge had become a launching pad. Someday, when the company was stable, when the debt was under control, she would find a new place. Something that was truly hers, bought with money she had earned rather than inherited or fought over. But that was a future problem. Tonight, she was just a woman going home after a long day, carrying nothing but the quiet satisfaction of having survived. The evening air was warm, carrying the scent of summer and the particular energy of a city that never quite stopped moving. Elena walked through it without hurrying, without checking her phone, without calculating the minutes, until she needed to be somewhere else, doing something else for someone else. She was free. The word felt strange in her mind, too simple for everything it contained. 3 months ago, freedom had been an abstraction, something she longed for without really understanding what it meant. Now, it was concrete. It was the weight of responsibility she had chosen, rather than responsibility that had been forced upon her. It was the knowledge that every decision from this point forward would be hers. She passed a shop window and caught her reflection in the glass. A woman in a business suit, hair slightly disheveled from a long day, face showing the tiredness that came from building something real. She looked older than she had 3 months ago. She looked younger too somehow, as if shedding the weight of her family's expectations had reversed something that had been aging her from the inside. She looked like herself. Finally, after 38 years, she looked like herself. The train station was crowded with commuters, everyone pressed together in the particular democracy of public transit, where wealth and position meant nothing, and the only thing that mattered was whether you could fit through the closing doors. Elena found a seat by the window, settled in, and watched the city slide past as the train climbed onto the elevated tracks. Chicago spread out below her, familiar and strange, the same city she had known her entire life, transformed by everything that had changed inside her. The buildings were the same. The streets were the same. But she was different, and that difference made everything look new. The train carried her north toward home, toward the life she was building one day at a time. Tomorrow there would be more work, more challenges, more problems to solve and decisions to make. Tomorrow the company that now bore her grandmother's name would demand her attention, her energy, her best thinking. But tonight, she was just a woman on a train going home after a long day free in a way she had never been before. The sun was setting over the lake, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, casting long shadows across the city that had made her and nearly broken her, and was now finally the place where she belonged. Elena leaned her head against the window and smiled. The journey was over. The story was just beginning.